The armory hallway smelled like gun oil and sweat, and the particular kind of dust that settles into military buildings after decades of boots grinding concrete into powder. It was 5:17 in the afternoon at Fort Liberty, North Carolina, and Armory Building 2 had transformed into controlled chaos. The late afternoon sun slanted through high windows caked with years of grime, casting long rectangles of golden light across the floor, where soldiers walked through them like ghosts passing through doorways. Outside, the temperature had climbed to 93 degrees, the kind of Carolina heat that pressed against your chest like a wet blanket. Inside the armory, industrial fans mounted on the walls pushed the hot air around without actually cooling anything. Soldiers filed through the heavy steel double doors in waves. Their voices bounced off bare concrete walls and metal ceiling beams, creating a symphony of masculine noise that would have overwhelmed anyone unfamiliar with military life. Rifle slings slapped against body armor with dull thuds. Spent magazines clinked into collection bins like coins dropping into a metal jar. Radios crackled with static and distant voices. Someone laughed too loud near the back entrance, the sound sharp and young and careless in the way that only young soldiers can be careless. The fluorescent lights overhead buzzed with a constant electrical hum. Somewhere in the back office, a coffee maker gurgled through its cycle. The smell of that coffee mixed with the gun oil and sweat to create an aroma that every soldier who had ever served would recognize instantly. This was the busiest hour on the entire installation. Weapon turn in after a full day of training exercises. Every soldier who had drawn a rifle that morning now stood in line to return it, signing logbooks, clearing chambers, proving to the armory sergeants that their weapons were safe and accounted for. The line stretched from the main counter all the way back to the double doors and curved around the clearing barrel station like a snake slowly digesting its prey. Private Ryan Beckett stood near the clearing barrel station with 3 other soldiers from his platoon. He was 32 years old, a late entry into the military after years of drifting through civilian life, and he carried himself like a man who believed the world owed him something simply for existing. His uniform was correct but not exceptional. His boots were polished to regulation standard but not beyond. Everything about him suggested a man who did exactly what was required and not 1 ounce more. But there was something in his posture that set him apart from the other soldiers in the room. A certain elevation of the chin, a particular set to the shoulders, the way his eyes moved across the crowd with judgment rather than observation. At 32, he was older than most privates, but his arrogance belonged to someone who had never truly been tested. He had the Beckett jaw. Everyone said so. That strong, squared-off chin that photographs captured so well in portraits of his grandfather. That same jaw appeared in the framed picture hanging in the main hallway of the Infantry Museum, the one showing Command Sergeant Major Thomas Beckett receiving the Medal of Honor from President Ford in 1976. In that photograph, Thomas Beckett stood ramrod straight despite the wounds that were still healing beneath his dress uniform. His eyes looked directly into the camera, with the gaze of a man who had seen the worst that humanity could offer and refused to break. Behind him, the flag hung in perfect stillness. On his chest, the pale blue ribbon of the Medal of Honor gleamed against the dark fabric. Ryan touched his own chin unconsciously whenever someone mentioned the resemblance. He did it now, leaning against the wall, watching the crowd of soldiers shuffle past. The gesture had become a habit, a way of reminding himself who he was, who he came from, what blood flowed through his veins. His grandfather was a legend. Every soldier at Fort Liberty knew the name Beckett. Thomas Iron Beckett, 14 months as a prisoner of war during a classified mission behind enemy lines. Tortured 17 times by his captors, but never broke, never gave up the positions of American troops, never betrayed his country. He had escaped twice and been recaptured twice, each time returning to his cell with more injuries and more determination. When he finally came home, gaunt and scarred and walking with a permanent limp, he had received the nation's highest military honor. Ryan's father had been a ranger who died in combat during Operation Gothic Serpent in Mogadishu. Another hero, another legend. Captain Daniel Beckett, who went down fighting in hostile territory and never came home. The Beckett blood ran through Ryan's veins like liquid courage. Or so he told himself every morning when he looked in the mirror and saw those same strong features staring back at him. He was destined for greatness. It was genetic, inevitable. The fact that he had wasted a decade after high school before finally enlisting was just a detour. The legacy was still waiting for him. He was telling a story now. Voice pitched loud enough for the soldiers around him to hear, loud enough to carry over the ambient noise of the armory. His audience consisted of 3 younger soldiers from his platoon, men in their early 20s who looked at him with the mixture of respect and skepticism that older privates always received. "I qualified expert on the M4 first try," he said. Range instructor said he had never seen anyone shoot like that straight out of basic. "Must be genetic, you know. My grandfather was a sniper during his covert ops days." 37 confirmed kills before they captured him. Best marksman in his entire unit. The soldiers around him nodded. Some impressed, some simply tolerating the boasting of a private who had not yet learned that the military valued humility over heritage. One of them, a kid from Minnesota named Patterson, shifted his weight and glanced toward the weapons counter with obvious impatience. "That is cool, man," Patterson said. "Hey, the line is moving." Ryan ignored the hint. He was too busy scanning the crowd, looking for opportunities to demonstrate his superiority, searching for any chance to prove that the Beckett name meant something in this building, full of soldiers who saw him as just another number, just another boot, just another private who did not know anything about anything. That is when he saw her. She walked through the double doors without announcement, without fanfare, without any of the chest-puffing posture that most soldiers adopted when entering a crowded room. She simply appeared, moving through the press of bodies like water flowing around stones in a riverbed. She was not tall, 5'6" at most. Her uniform fit perfectly. Not a single wrinkle visible despite the late hour and the oppressive heat. No loose threads, no dust stains, no darkened patches of sweat under her arms or across her back like everyone else in the building. Her boots gleamed with a shine that spoke of discipline maintained over years, not the frantic polish of someone preparing for inspection. She carried her rifle with textbook precision, barrel pointed down and away at exactly the correct angle, finger resting along the receiver, never near the trigger. The weapon moved with her body like an extension of her own limbs, natural and unconscious and utterly controlled. Most soldiers carried their rifles like tools. She carried hers like a partner. Her face told a story that Ryan was too inexperienced to read. She was 42 years old, though she could have passed for 35 in the right light. A thin scar ran from her left temple down to the edge of her jaw, pale against skin that had seen too much sun in too many dangerous places. The scar had healed clean but had never faded. A permanent record of violence survived. Her eyes were what caught attention and held it, pale gray with flecks of blue that seemed to absorb light rather than reflect it. They scanned the room constantly, moving in a pattern that spoke of years of training, cataloging exits and threats and potential problems with the quiet vigilance of someone who had learned that complacency could kill. Every person she looked at was assessed and categorized in half a second. Threat, no threat, unknown. The calculations happened automatically, as natural as breathing. Her hair was pulled back in a regulation bun, not a single strand out of place. Her posture was perfect, but not rigid. She moved with the fluid economy of a predator at rest, each step precisely measured, each motion serving a purpose. She was Master Sergeant Elena Mercer, 20 years of service, 5 combat deployments across 3 different continents. Author of the current Army Combatives Manual, primary instructor for Tier 1 selection courses, the woman whose special operations candidates whispered about in the hallways of training facilities across the country. But Ryan Beckett did not know any of that. All he saw was a woman in uniform who moved too quietly, whose face showed no expression, whose presence seemed to demand the respect that he believed should be reserved for people like himself. People with history, people with legacy, people whose grandfathers had medals displayed in museums. He saw an opportunity. "Hey," he said to his buddy Patterson, nodding toward the woman. "Check this out. Watch this." His friend glanced over, saw nothing remarkable, shrugged. "Ryan, maybe you should just wait in line like everyone else." But Ryan was already moving. He pushed off from the wall and walked directly into her path, positioning himself between her and the weapons counter. He crossed his arms over his chest and adopted what he believed was an intimidating stance. Feet planted wide, chin lifted at an angle he had practiced in mirrors since he was a teenager. She stopped walking. For a moment, neither of them moved. The noise of the armory continued around them, soldiers talking and weapons clinking and sergeants calling out serial numbers. None of them noticed the confrontation taking shape near the clearing barrel station. Or if they noticed, they chose not to intervene. Not their business, not their problem. "Nice rifle," Ryan said, loud enough for his friends to hear. His voice dripped with something between mockery and challenge. He let his eyes travel down the length of her weapon with exaggerated scrutiny. "Looks like you have taken good care of it for a support soldier." She said nothing. Her expression did not change by even a fraction of a degree. She simply adjusted her trajectory slightly, stepping to the left to move around him. He sidestepped right, blocking her again. Something flickered in her eyes, something cold and measuring and ancient. The look a hawk gives a mouse before deciding whether the effort of killing it is worth the calories gained. But her face remained neutral, and Ryan was too arrogant to recognize the warning. "You know," he continued, leaning forward into her personal space, "I have not seen your face around here before. What unit are you with? Support? Admin? Maybe supply corps?" He emphasized the words with contempt. In his limited understanding of military hierarchy, support personnel existed somewhere beneath real soldiers, beneath the warriors, beneath men like him who were destined for special forces and ranger school and all the glory that came with combat arms. The fact that she was female only reinforced his assumptions. She stepped left again. He mirrored right, faster this time, enjoying the game. His friends were watching now. Good. Let them see how a Beckett handled himself. A corporal standing 10 feet away shifted uncomfortably. He was older, maybe 35, with the weathered look of someone who had learned lessons that Ryan had not yet encountered. There were deployment patches on his right shoulder, multiple deployments. His name tape read Morrison. Corporal Morrison muttered something under his breath, words that sounded like a warning. "Beckett, leave her alone. Seriously, you do not want to do this." Ryan waved him off without breaking eye contact with the woman. "Relax, Morrison. I just want to check her weapon. Make sure it is safe. Standard protocol, right? Safety first. We all have to follow the rules, even the admin girls." His friends snickered behind him. Patterson had stopped looking impatient. Now he looked uncomfortable, but he said nothing. The bystander effect in full operation. The woman stopped moving. For the first time, she looked directly at him. Her eyes met his and held them. Looking into those pale gray depths was like looking into the barrel of a weapon. Empty, cold, patient. When she spoke, her voice was soft, not weak, not timid. Soft in the way that a blade is soft when it slides from its sheath. Soft in the way that falling snow is soft before it buries you alive. No, one word. No explanation, no negotiation, no raising of the voice or tightening of the jaw or any of the other signs of anger that Ryan expected. Just a single syllable, delivered with absolute finality. Ryan blinked. His smirk faltered for half a second before returning, sharper now, meaner, wounded by the simple rejection. Nobody told him no, not here, not in front of his friends, not some random female soldier who did not even have the courtesy to show proper respect for a Beckett. His grandfather had survived torture in a prison camp. His father had died fighting in the streets of Mogadishu. And this woman thought she could just say no to him like he was nothing? "Fine," he said. His voice had changed. Harder now, uglier. The wounded pride of a man who had never learned that ego was not the same thing as strength. "Then I will just take it myself." He reached forward. His fingers closed around the rough canvas strap of her rifle sling. His ego overflowed like water from a dam breaking, chest puffed out, jaw set, absolutely certain that he was in control of the situation. He pulled. What happened next would be discussed in whispered conversations across Fort Liberty for months afterward. It would be analyzed in training classrooms. It would be referenced in after-action reviews. It would become legend. No one saw her move. Corporal Morrison, who had been watching nervously from 10 feet away, would later swear under oath that she simply blurred, like a video skipping frames. One moment she was standing still, as motionless as a statue. The next moment, Ryan Beckett was falling through space. There was no wind up, no telegraph, no shifting of weight or tensing of muscles that might have warned an observer what was about to happen. The laws of physics seemed to bend around her as she moved with a speed that the human eye could not track. His hand was still reaching upward, frozen in mid-grab, when his back hit the concrete floor with a sound like a side of beef dropped from a meat truck. The impact drove every molecule of air from his lungs in a single violent exhalation. His eyes went wide, pupils dilating until the irises were thin rings of color, staring up at the fluorescent lights without seeing them. His mouth opened and closed like a fish thrown onto dry land, desperately trying to breathe, completely failing. His wrist throbbed where her grip had locked his joint at an angle it was never designed to occupy. His lower back screamed with pain from the impact. His pride lay scattered across the concrete floor in pieces too small to ever reassemble. She stood exactly where she had been before. Her rifle remained in position, sling undisturbed. Her breathing was steady, controlled, unchanged. No sweat on her forehead, no tension in her shoulders, no satisfaction in her eyes. Just calm. The kind of calm that only comes from doing something so many times that it requires no more thought than blinking. The armory fell silent. 137 soldiers stopped talking simultaneously. Weapons stopped clinking. Boots stopped scraping. Even the radio seemed to quiet, as if the electronic equipment itself recognized that something significant had just occurred. The industrial fans continued their rotation, pushing hot air through a room that had suddenly turned cold. Corporal Morrison's clipboard clattered to the floor. His jaw hung open. His mind tried to process what his eyes had witnessed and failed completely. What just happened? Ryan wheezed on the ground, one hand pressed against his chest where his diaphragm spasmed uselessly, the other rubbing his wrist where ligaments had been stretched to their absolute limit. His face was crimson, half from the struggle to breathe, half from the burning humiliation spreading through his body like wildfire. He had never been on the ground before. Not like this. Not put there by someone else. Not in front of witnesses. She looked down at him. Her expression had not changed by a single degree. She might have been looking at a puddle of spilled coffee for all the emotion she displayed. You do not grab another soldier's weapon. 6 words, delivered in the same soft, firm tone. A statement of fact, not a threat. A lesson, not a punishment. Then she stepped over him like he was a crack in the sidewalk and continued walking toward the armory counter. A staff sergeant came hurrying from the back office, clipboard in hand, face tight with concern. He was a heavy-set man in his 40s, the kind of non-commissioned officer who had found his calling in administrative work and wore the satisfaction of that calling in his comfortable posture and unhurried movements. What happened here? Who is on the ground? Someone better start talking right now, before anyone could respond, before anyone could lie or distort or spin the story into something more palatable. The overhead security monitor beeped twice. Every head in the armory turned toward the screen mounted above the main counter. The security system at Armory Building 2 was equipped with motion detection that automatically captured and replayed any sudden impact or movement in the weapons handling area. Safety protocol implemented after an incident 3 years ago, designed to record negligent discharges and accidents for training purposes. Today, it captured something very different. The footage played on the monitor in high definition. The timestamp showed 17:23:07. Ryan's hand reaching forward, confident, aggressive, his fingers closing around the sling strap. Then her weight shifting just an inch, her left foot pivoting smoothly on the concrete exactly 15 degrees, her right wrist catching his thumb joint at precisely the correct angle for maximum leverage with minimum effort. The motion was so fast that the camera barely captured it, even at 30 frames per second. A twist that hyperextended his wrist, a sweep that took his feet out from under him, her leg hooking behind his knee at the exact moment his balance shifted forward. A controlled takedown that put him on the ground without causing permanent injury, but with overwhelming, undeniable force. Total elapsed time displayed in the corner of the screen, 1.3 seconds. Then Ryan on the floor, gasping like a landed fish, and her standing motionless above him, as if nothing had happened. The staff sergeant's eyes went wide. He grabbed the remote from the counter, rewound the footage, watched it again. His mouth opened slightly. He looked at her, standing calmly at the counter, signing her weapon into inventory. He looked back at the screen. He watched it a third time. "That is advanced combatives," he said slowly. His voice carried through the silent armory like a stone dropped into still water, ripples spreading outward to every ear in the room. Level 3 disarm protocol, pressure point manipulation combined with joint lock, takedown, and sweep. They only teach that to certain people. He stopped. His face went pale. The clipboard trembled slightly in his hands. A younger soldier near the back whispered to his battle buddy, "What? They only teach that to who?" His friend shook his head slowly, eyes fixed on the woman at the counter, with something approaching awe. "I do not know, man, but I am not asking." The armory sergeant approached her carefully as she finished signing the logbook. Her handwriting was neat and precise, each letter formed with the same controlled economy she brought to everything else. She did not look up as he approached. "Ma'am?" His voice had changed completely, no longer the casual tone he used with regular soldiers. This was respectful, careful, the kind of careful you used when you suspected you were dealing with something far above your pay grade. "May I see your identification card, please?" She reached into her left cargo pocket without hesitation. No defensiveness, no concern, no acknowledgement that anything unusual had just occurred. She pulled out her common access card in its tan protective sleeve and handed it over. The sergeant scanned it under the reader. The computer beeped. Data populated the screen. His eyes moved across the text, and with each word he read, his face lost more color. He looked at the card, then at her face, then at the card, then at the computer screen, then at her again. The sequence repeated 3 times before he found his voice. "You are Master Sergeant Mercer? The Master Sergeant Mercer?" The hallway outside the armory had filled with soldiers who had witnessed the confrontation through the windows or heard about it from the rapidly spreading whispers. Now those whispers erupted into a cascade of recognition. "Wait, Mercer? The Mercer? Ghost Mercer? Oh no, oh no, no, no. That guy just tried to grab a weapon from Ghost. Is that really her? She is supposed to be at Bragg." "It is not Bragg anymore. It is Liberty." "Whatever, man. Is that really her?" "Look at the scar. That is definitely her. I heard she killed 6 insurgents with a knife in Korengal. I heard it was her bare hands. I heard she does not even feel pain anymore." Master Sergeant Elena Mercer was not just another senior non-commissioned officer pushing paperwork and managing training schedules. She was not simply a name on a duty roster or a face at morning formation. She was not even merely an excellent soldier among many excellent soldiers. She was the Ghost. The woman who had written the current edition of Field Manual 3-25.150, the official Army Combatives Manual used by every soldier in the United States military. The woman who personally trained Delta Force candidates and Ranger School instructors and Special Operations medical personnel who needed to fight their way to casualties. The woman whose techniques were studied in classrooms and practiced in gyms and tested in combat zones around the world. She had earned her nickname on her 3rd deployment in the mountains of eastern Afghanistan, where she had moved through enemy positions so quietly that insurgents started whispering about American spirits who could kill without being seen. The name had followed her home and stuck like a second skin. A specialist with 4 years in service leaned toward his buddy, his voice trembling with the kind of reverent fear usually reserved for ghost stories and campfire tales. "She is the reason half our combatives instructors teach the techniques they do now. She literally rewrote the doctrine. They brought her back from deployment specifically to update the manual after she survived a compound breach in Korengal, where she stopped, swallowed, did not finish the sentence." "Where she what?" his buddy asked. The specialist shook his head. "Does not matter. Point is, that guy just tried to disrespect someone who could kill him 6 different ways before he hit the ground." Ryan Beckett finally managed to stand. His legs wobbled beneath him. His face had gone from crimson to pale white as the blood drained away along with his confidence. He had heard the name Mercer before. Everyone in the Army had. He just never imagined he would meet her like this. He opened his mouth to apologize, but no words came out. The most his voice could produce was a strangled croak that might have been the beginning of a word or might have been a sob. Then a new voice cut through the murmuring crowd. "You absolute idiot." The soldiers parted like water before a ship's bow. A man walked through the gap, moving with the deliberate pace of someone who had stopped hurrying decades ago, but still commanded respect with every step. Sergeant First Class Marcus Webb was 52 years old. He had served in the Gulf War under the burning oil fields of Kuwait and in the early days of Afghanistan when the mountains still held their secrets. His hair was more gray than black now, the color of weathered steel. His face was lined with the kind of wrinkles that come from too much sun and too many sleepless nights in hostile territory. But his eyes were sharp and fixed on Ryan Beckett with an expression that mixed disappointment with something deeper, something that looked almost like grief. Webb had known Thomas Beckett since 1991. He had served under the old man's command during the liberation of Kuwait when they pushed Iraqi forces back across the desert in 100 hours of controlled violence. He had been there when Thomas finally retired in 2003, had helped the legend pack up his office, had promised to keep an eye on the family. Now he stood in front of Thomas's grandson, watching the man tremble with shock and humiliation. And he felt the weight of 30 years of history pressing down on his shoulders like a full combat load. "Come with me," Webb said. His voice left no room for argument. "Now." He grabbed Ryan by the arm and pulled him toward the side door of the armory, away from the crowd, away from the whispers, away from the security footage that would probably end up on every computer screen in the battalion by morning. Ryan stumbled along, still too dazed to resist. They emerged into the fading afternoon light outside the armory. The sun was dropping toward the tree line, painting the sky in shades of orange and red that neither man noticed. The heat was still oppressive, but after the tension of the armory, the open air felt like relief. Webb released Ryan's arm and turned to face him. For a long moment, he simply stared at the man, taking in the fear and confusion and wounded pride. "Do you have any idea what you just did?" Webb asked. His voice was quiet now. Dangerous quiet, the quiet before artillery strikes. Ryan shook his head. "I did not know who she was. I was just trying to—" "Just what? Just trying to show off for your buddies? Just trying to prove you are a big man because your grandfather was a hero?" Ryan's jaw tightened at the mention of his grandfather, but he said nothing. There was nothing to say. Webb stepped closer. "Let me tell you something about Master Sergeant Mercer that you do not know. Something that is about to make this day a lot worse for you." "What are you talking about?" Webb studied Ryan's face for a moment, searching for something. Perhaps he was looking for traces of Thomas in the man's features. The same jaw, the same set of the eyes, but the character behind those features remained to be determined. He sighed. "Elena Mercer," he said slowly, "was orphaned when she was 8 years old. Her parents were both Army, veterans of conflicts that broke something inside them. They came home from the war with wounds that nobody could see, wounds that ate them alive from the inside out for years, until one day they could not take it anymore." Ryan's confusion deepened, his brow furrowed. "What does that have to do with anything?" "Your grandfather," Webb continued, "was the one who found her after her parents died. He was friends with her father, served with him during a classified mission years before. When he heard what happened to the family, he drove 300 miles to the Children's Services office in Tennessee and signed the adoption papers that same day. Did not even stop to pack a bag." The words hung in the air between them like smoke from a distant fire. Ryan's mouth opened, closed, opened again. "Adoption papers," he repeated. His voice sounded distant even to his own ears, like someone else was speaking through his mouth. Webb nodded. "Your grandfather, Thomas Beckett, adopted Elena Mercer when she was 8 years old. He raised her in his house alongside your father. He taught her everything he knew about survival and combat and discipline. He treated her like the daughter he never had." Ryan's legs felt weak. He reached out and steadied himself against the armory wall. The rough concrete bit into his palm, but he barely noticed. "That means she is your grandfather's adopted daughter," Webb finished. "Your father, Daniel's adopted sister. Your aunt, in every way that matters except blood. The woman who sat at your family's dinner table for decades. The woman who learned to shoot from the same man who taught your father. The woman who was there when your father graduated Ranger School." The world tilted beneath Ryan's feet. He had just tried to humiliate his own family. He had just been put on the ground by a woman who had grown up in his grandfather's house, who had sat at his grandfather's dinner table, who had learned to fight from the same legend whose blood ran through Ryan's veins. And he had done it in front of more than 100 soldiers who would spread the story across the entire installation before sunset. "I did not know," he whispered. "Grandpa never told me about her." "Your grandfather," Webb said, his voice hardening, "has a lot of things he never told you. Things about Elena, things about what happened overseas, things about your father, things about a valley in Afghanistan called Korangal." Ryan looked up. Korangal? It was a name he had heard before. A valley in Afghanistan that soldiers spoke about in hushed tones, like saying the name too loud might summon the ghosts of the men who died there. The Valley of Death, some called it. The place where more American soldiers had been killed per capita than anywhere else in the entire war. "What about Korangal? What does that have to do with any of this?" Webb was silent for the long moment. The sun had dropped lower, and his face was half in shadow now. When he spoke again, his voice had changed, softer now, almost gentle, the voice of a man about to deliver news that would hurt. That is not my story to tell. But you need to understand something, Ryan. Elena Mercer is not just your aunt. She is not just a combat veteran or a master of fighting. He paused, weighing his next words carefully. She is the only person your grandfather trusts to keep certain secrets. Secrets about what happened overseas. Secrets about the people who did not come home. Secrets that have kept this family together, and secrets that could tear it apart. Ryan's heart was pounding now. A cold feeling spread through his chest, the instinctive recognition that he was standing at the edge of something much larger than a simple confrontation in an armory, much larger than wounded pride, much larger than a takedown caught on camera. What secrets? What are you talking about? Webb looked at him for a long time. The evening light caught the gray in his hair, the lines around his eyes, the weight of decades of military service written across his weathered features. Secrets about Korengal, he said finally, and secrets about your father. Ryan felt the blood drain from his face. My father died in Mogadishu, he said. His voice trembled despite his efforts to control it. In '93, he was a ranger. He died a hero. That is what everyone says. That is what Grandpa always told me. Webb's expression shifted. Something that might have been pity. Something that might have been regret. Something that might have been the weight of secrets carried too long. Is that what they told you? The question hit Ryan like a physical blow. He staggered back a step, shoulders pressing against the concrete wall of the armory. What do you mean? That is what happened. That is what everyone says. That is what Grandpa told me when I was old enough to understand. He died in combat, October 3rd, 1993, Operation Gothic Serpent. His helicopter went down and he gave his life. Your grandfather, Webb interrupted, has spent decades protecting you from certain truths. He and Elena both. They decided a long time ago that some things were better left buried, that some stories were too painful to tell, that some secrets would do more harm than good. Ryan shook his head. No, my father was a hero. He died in combat. He died serving his country. I am not saying he was not brave, Webb said quietly. I am not saying he did not serve with honor. But there are things about Daniel Beckett that you do not know. Things that happened after Mogadishu. Things that Elena saw with her own eyes. Things that changed everyone who was there. The sun had dropped below the tree line now. Shadows stretched across the ground, reaching toward Ryan like dark fingers. The heat was finally beginning to fade, but Ryan felt cold. Cold in a way that had nothing to do with temperature. In the distance, the armory door opened. Master Sergeant Elena Mercer emerged, her weapon now secured in the inventory. She paused at the entrance, her silhouette framed against the light from inside. The scar on her face caught the last rays of sunlight and gleamed like a silver thread. She looked toward the two men standing in the shadows. For a moment, her eyes met Ryan's. He could not read her expression from this distance, could not tell if she was angry or disappointed or simply indifferent to the nephew who had tried to humiliate her in front of the entire armory. Then she turned and walked away, disappearing into the gathering darkness between the buildings. Silent, controlled, a ghost fading into the shadows. Webb put a hand on Ryan's shoulder. You want to know the truth about your family? About your father? About what really happened and why Elena carries the scars she carries? Ryan nodded. His voice had abandoned him completely. Then you need to talk to her, and you need to be ready for answers you will not want to hear. Webb released his shoulder and stepped back. But I will warn you once, Private Beckett. Whatever you think you know about the Beckett legacy, whatever stories you grew up on hearing about heroes and honor and glory, the truth is a lot more complicated and a lot more painful. He turned and began walking toward the barracks, leaving Ryan alone in the shadows. The young man stood there for a long time, watching the spot where Elena had disappeared. His mind raced through fragments of memory, his grandfather's reluctance to talk about certain subjects, the photographs in the family home that showed a young girl with serious eyes standing beside Thomas Beckett, the way his mother had always changed the subject when Ryan asked about his father's service. 32 years of carefully constructed mythology, crumbling like sandcastles before an incoming tide. In the distance, a bugle played Evening Retreat. The flag was coming down for the night at the post headquarters. Soldiers all across Fort Liberty stopped what they were doing and stood at attention, facing the direction of the music. Ryan stood at attention too, his body responding automatically to training, but his mind was elsewhere. Somewhere in the darkness, Elena Mercer was walking toward her quarters, carrying secrets that had shaped his entire family for decades. Somewhere in Virginia, his grandfather, Thomas Beckett, sat in a chair at the Veterans Care Center, his hands trembling slightly from the Parkinson's disease that was slowly stealing his body's control, unaware that the carefully guarded past was about to come flooding back. And somewhere in the depths of Ryan's chest, beneath the wounded pride and the shock and the confusion, something new was taking root. Doubt. For the first time in his life, Ryan Beckett wondered if the legacy he had been so proud of was built on foundations of truth or foundations of carefully maintained lies. The bugle finished its mournful call. The last note hung in the air for a moment, then faded into silence. Night fell over Fort Liberty, and in the armory, the security footage continued to loop on the monitor, playing the same 1.3 seconds over and over again. A permanent record of the moment when a man's arrogance collided with a woman's discipline and lost. 1.3 seconds. That was all it took to change everything. The barracks were quiet when Ryan finally walked through the door. His roommate, a younger soldier from Ohio named Torres, looked up from his bunk, took one look at Ryan's face, and chose to say nothing. Some expressions required no explanation. Ryan sat on the edge of his bed and stared at the wall. The fluorescent lights hummed overhead. Somewhere down the hall, someone was playing music too loud, the bass thumping through the walls like a distant heartbeat. On the nightstand beside him sat a framed photograph. His grandfather in dress uniform, chest covered with medals, the Medal of Honor gleaming at his throat like a small blue star. Behind Thomas Beckett in the photograph stood a young woman in army fatigues. She could not have been more than 25. Her face was serious, her eyes were watchful, her posture was perfect. Ryan had looked at that photograph countless times. He had never once asked who the woman was. Now he picked up the frame and studied her face. The same pale eyes, the same controlled expression, the same posture of coiled readiness. Younger, yes, without the scar, without the weight of 20 more years of service, but unmistakably the same person. Elena, she had been there all along, hidden in plain sight in his own family photographs, and he had never known, never asked, never wondered. How many other things had he never asked about? How many other secrets were hiding in plain sight, waiting to be discovered by someone who finally thought to look? He set the frame face down on the nightstand. The thump it made against the wood seemed very loud in the quiet room. Tomorrow he would find her. Tomorrow he would ask the questions he should have asked years ago. Tomorrow the truth would begin to emerge from the shadows where it had been buried for 3 decades. But tonight, Ryan Beckett lay awake in the darkness, listening to the sounds of the bass settling into sleep, wondering how much of his life had been built on lies. And 500 miles away, in a small room at the Virginia Veterans Care Center, Command Sergeant Major Thomas Beckett woke from a restless sleep with his adopted daughter's name on his lips. His hands trembled as he reached for the phone on his nightstand. The Parkinson's made even this simple movement difficult now. He had to concentrate, had to force his fingers to close around the device, had to will his arm to lift it to his ear. It was time. The secrets had stayed buried long enough. He dialed the number from memory, the number that only 4 people in the world possessed. His fingers shook as they pressed each digit, but they did not fail him. The phone rang twice before she answered. "Papa," Elena's voice. Even through the phone, even after all these years, it still carried the same calm control that had defined her since childhood. The same steadiness, the same strength. Thomas closed his eyes. The Parkinson's made his voice shake, but his mind remained sharp. Sharper, perhaps, than it had been in years. Grief and guilt had a way of focusing the thoughts. "Ryan knows," he said. "About you. Webb called me an hour ago." Silence on the other end of the line. He could hear her breathing, steady and controlled, processing the information, calculating the implications. "How much does he know?" Elena asked finally. "Not everything. Not yet. But he is asking questions now. The kind of questions that lead to other questions. The kind that do not stop until they find answers." Another pause, longer this time. When she spoke again, her voice was softer, more human, less ghost. "What do you want me to do?" Thomas Beckett had lived through hell. He had survived 14 months as a prisoner of war in a place where men broke under torture and betrayed everything they believed in just to make the pain stop. He had watched friends die in his arms. He had carried secrets that would have destroyed lesser men. But nothing had ever been harder than this moment. "Tell him the truth," Thomas said. His voice cracked on the last word like old wood splitting. About Daniel, about Korengal, about everything. Papa, Elena began. He is a Beckett, Thomas interrupted. For better or worse, he carries the name. He deserves to know what that name really means, what it really costs. Elena was quiet for a long time. Through the phone, Thomas could hear the sounds of Fort Liberty at night, distant voices, the rumble of a vehicle, the eternal hum of a military installation that never truly sleeps. When she spoke again, her voice was barely above a whisper. Some truths break people, then we will find out what he is made of. Thomas hung up the phone and lay back against his pillow. Through the window, stars were emerging in the Virginia sky, the same stars that had watched over him during the darkest nights of his captivity decades ago. The same stars that had witnessed everything that came after. He had built a legacy on discipline and honor and sacrifice. He had raised two children, one by blood and one by choice. And he had tried to teach them both that true strength came from within. That character mattered more than reputation. That the measure of a person was not in how they succeeded, but in how they faced failure. Now that legacy was about to be tested in ways he had never anticipated. The old soldier closed his eyes and waited for dawn, knowing that when the sun rose, nothing in the Beckett family would ever be the same. 1.3 seconds had changed everything. What came next would change it even more. The Virginia Veterans Care Center sat on 12 acres of manicured grounds 40 miles west of Richmond. Oak trees lined the main drive, their branches heavy with the green of late summer. The buildings were brick and white trim, designed to look more like a college campus than a medical facility. But everyone who visited knew what this place really was. A final posting for warriors whose battles had followed them home. Elena Mercer pulled her rental car into the visitor lot at 7 in the morning. She had driven through the night from Fort Liberty, 500 miles of highway and darkness and memories that refused to stay buried. The sun was just cresting the tree line, painting the brick buildings in shades of gold and amber. She sat in the car for a long moment, hands resting on the steering wheel, watching the light change. Through the windshield, she could see the main entrance where orderlies in blue scrubs were beginning their morning rounds. A man in a wheelchair sat near the garden, his face turned toward the sunrise. Her father was in there, the only father she had ever really known. Thomas Beckett had been 71 years old for 3 months now. The Parkinson's diagnosis had come 2 years ago, though Elena suspected he had been hiding symptoms for longer than that. Thomas Beckett did not believe in showing weakness. He had learned that lesson in a prison cell half a world away, in a time when showing weakness could get you killed. She finally stepped out of the car. The morning air was cool and carried the smell of fresh-cut grass. Somewhere in the distance, a lawnmower hummed. Normal sounds, peaceful sounds, the sounds of a world that had moved on from the wars that still lived inside the people who fought them. The reception desk recognized her immediately. Master Sergeant Mercer was a regular visitor, though her visits were always unannounced. She preferred it that way. Announcements allowed time for preparation, and Thomas Beckett was too proud a man to let his daughter see him struggling if he had warning. Room 147, second floor, East Wing. She walked the familiar hallways, her boots silent on the polished floors. The walls were decorated with photographs of veterans from every era. World War II, Korea, Desert Storm, Iraq, Afghanistan, faces young and old, proud and haunted, alive and dead. A memorial to service that stretched back nearly a century. She stopped outside his door. Through the small window, she could see him sitting in his chair by the window. His back was to the door. His shoulders were still broad, still carried the posture of a soldier, but they trembled now with the constant tremor that the medication could only reduce, never eliminate. Elena took a breath. Then she opened the door. Papa. He did not turn immediately. His movements were slower now, deliberate, each motion requiring concentration that it never used to require. But when he finally faced her, his eyes were sharp, clear. The eyes of a man whose mind remained a fortress even as his body betrayed him. You drove all night, he said. It was not a question. She crossed the room and sat in the chair across from him. The morning light fell between them, catching the dust motes that drifted in the air. On the table beside his bed sat the same photograph that Ryan kept in his barracks. Thomas in dress uniform, Elena standing behind him. A family portrait frozen in time. Webb called you, she said. Thomas nodded slowly. The tremor in his hands was worse this morning. He clasped them together in his lap, a gesture that had become habit over the past 2 years. hiding weakness even from his own daughter. He told me what happened at the armory. Told me Ryan tried to take your weapon. He did, and you put him on the ground. Elena's expression did not change. 1.3 seconds. A ghost of a smile crossed Thomas's weathered face. I taught you that technique. 40 years ago, in the backyard of the house on Maple Street. She remembered. She remembered everything about those early years. The grief that had nearly drowned her after her parents died. The strange house that became her home. The man who had taken her in without hesitation, who had given her a name and a purpose and a reason to keep breathing when breathing seemed impossible. I remember, she said softly. You told me that speed was less important than precision, that a properly executed technique would work regardless of size or strength. Thomas's hands trembled against each other. And I told you something else, something more important. Elena nodded. You told me to never use what I learned unless I had no other choice. You told me that real warriors avoid fights. They do not seek them. The smile faded from Thomas's face. His eyes grew distant, looking at something far beyond the walls of his room. I told you that because I knew what fighting really costs. Not the physical cost. That heals. The other cost. The one that stays with you. The one that wakes you up at 3 in the morning and whispers that you could have done something different. Something better. Something that would not have ended with blood on your hands. Elena felt the old familiar weight settle onto her chest. The weight she carried every day. The weight that never got lighter no matter how many years passed. Ryan does not know, she said. About Daniel. About what really happened. Thomas closed his eyes. His hands trembled more violently now, and he pressed them against his thighs to still them. I know, and I know you have been protecting him from that truth for over 20 years. You and me both. But secrets have a way of coming out, Elena. The longer you bury them, the more damage they do when they finally break free. He opened his eyes and looked directly at her. His gaze was steady despite the tremors that shook the rest of his body. It is time to tell him the truth. All of it. About his father. About Mogadishu. About what happened after Daniel came home. About what happened at Fort Benning in 2003. Elena felt something crack inside her chest. A fissure in the wall she had built around those memories. A wall she had maintained for 2 decades through sheer force of will. Papa, she said, her voice was barely a whisper. If I tell him the truth about Daniel, it will destroy everything he believes about his father. Everything he believes about himself. Thomas reached out with his trembling hand and took hers. His grip was weaker than it used to be, but it was still the grip of a man who had held on through 14 months of hell and never let go. Sometimes, he said, the things we believe have to be destroyed before we can see what is real. I learned that in a cell overseas decades ago. I learned that the stories we tell ourselves to survive are not always the stories we need to live. He squeezed her hand. Ryan is a Beckett. He is arrogant and foolish, and he has more ego than sense. But he is also still capable of change. The young can change if they are given a reason to. You changed. I watched you change from a broken little girl into the strongest person I have ever known. Ryan can change too, but not if we keep lying to him. Elena looked down at their joined hands. Her skin was weathered from years of sun and sand and combat. His skin was thin with age, marked with liver spots and the faded scars of old wounds. 2 warriors at different stages of the same long journey. She thought about Ryan, the jaw that looked so much like Daniel's, the arrogance that reminded her of another man who had believed that legacy was a substitute for character. She thought about Daniel. Daniel Beckett had been her brother in every way that mattered. He had been 10 years old when Thomas brought her home, a serious boy with his father's eyes and his father's determination to prove himself worthy of the Beckett name. He had accepted her without question, had shown her where to find the good hiding spots in the backyard, had taught her how to throw a baseball. And then he had grown up and gone to war and come back as someone else entirely. The memory rose unbidden, as it always did when she thought about Daniel. Not the memory of finding him. That memory she had learned to suppress, to push down into the dark places where it could not ambush her during daylight hours. No, the memory that came now was older, from the days before Mogadishu, from the time when Daniel was still Daniel and the future still seemed bright. Summer of 1992. She was 14 years old. Daniel was 27, already a captain, already married to a woman named Sarah who had gentle eyes and a laugh that filled rooms. They had just learned that Sarah was pregnant. They were going to name the baby Ryan after Sarah's father. Elena remembered the cookout in the backyard of Daniel and Sarah's small house near Fort Benning. Thomas was there, grilling steaks with the precision he brought to everything. Sarah was sitting in a lawn chair, one hand resting on her belly, smiling at something Daniel had said. And Daniel was standing by the fence, looking out at the sunset, and his eyes were already somewhere else. Even then, even before Mogadishu. Some part of him was already looking toward the horizon, toward the wars that were coming, toward the legacy he was determined to build. Elena had walked over and stood beside him. "What are you thinking about?" Daniel had smiled, but the smile did not quite reach his eyes. "I am thinking about what it means to be a Beckett, what it means to live up to that name. Dad was a hero, everyone knows that. Medal of Honor, 14 months in a prison camp. He never broke, never gave up, never showed weakness." He had turned to look at her then, and she saw something in his eyes that she did not understand at the time. Something that looked almost like fear. What if I am not strong enough? What if I get tested like he did and I fail? What if I am not the man everyone thinks I am? Elena had been too young to give him a real answer. She had just shrugged and said something about how no one expected him to be his father, how everyone just wanted him to be himself. But Daniel had shaken his head. "That is not how it works, Elena. Not in this family. The Beckett name means something, and every generation has to prove they deserve it." 14 months later, he was in Mogadishu, and nothing was ever the same again. Thomas's voice brought her back to the present. "You are thinking about him, about before." Elena nodded. She did not ask how he knew. Thomas always knew. "I was thinking about that summer, the cookout at his house, when Sarah told everyone about the baby." Thomas was quiet for a long moment. His hands continued to tremble. Outside the window, the sun had risen fully, flooding the room with light. "I remember that day," he said finally. "I remember watching Daniel standing by that fence, looking at the horizon like he was already seeing the battles that were coming. And I remember thinking that I had made a mistake." Elena looked at him sharply. "What kind of mistake?" "I raised him to believe that being a Beckett meant being invincible, that showing weakness was failure, that real men did not struggle, did not doubt, did not break. I raised him the way my father raised me, the way his father raised him. A chain of iron men going back generations." Thomas's voice cracked, and for a moment Elena saw something she had rarely seen in decades of knowing this man. Regret. Deep, bottomless regret. "But I was wrong, Elena. I was wrong about all of it. Real strength is not about never breaking. It is about what you do after you break. It is about getting back up. It is about asking for help when you need it. I did not learn that until it was too late, until Daniel was already gone." Elena felt tears burning behind her eyes. She blinked them back. Crying was a luxury she rarely allowed herself. "You could not have known what would happen." "Could I not?" Thomas shook his head slowly. "I knew Daniel was struggling when he came back from Mogadishu. I could see it in his eyes, the same look I saw in the eyes of men who came back from the camps, the look of someone who had seen too much, done too much, lost too much. But I told myself he was a Beckett, told myself he would handle it, told myself that asking if he was okay would be an insult to his strength." He looked out the window at the morning light. "I was a coward, Elena. I was too afraid of my own memories to face his. And by the time I finally found the courage to talk to him, it was 10 years too late." The silence that followed was heavy with the weight of years, the weight of things unsaid and undone, the weight of a father who had failed his son in the most fundamental way possible, not through absence or cruelty, but through the belief that strength meant suffering alone. Elena thought about the letter she had found in Daniel's hand on that terrible morning at Fort Benning, the letter she had never shown anyone, not even Thomas, the letter she had carried with her for over 20 years, like a wound that refused to heal. "Daniel wrote me a letter," she said. Her voice sounded strange to her own ears, distant, hollow. "Before he died, he left it for me." Thomas looked at her. His eyes were wet, though no tears fell. He nodded slowly. "I know," he said. "I have always known. You never told me what it said and I never asked. But I knew there was something you were carrying, something heavy, something that was not just grief." Elena's hands were shaking now too, a different kind of tremor than her father's, the tremor of walls finally beginning to crumble. "He told me about Mogadishu," she said, "about what really happened, about the decision he made that day, the decision that got 2 men killed." She closed her eyes, and the words of the letter came back to her as clearly as if she were reading them again for the first time. He wrote that he made a call during the battle. The Rangers were pinned down, taking fire from multiple positions. He had to choose between two options. Both options meant some of his men would die. There was no good choice, only less bad choices. And he chose wrong. Two men died who might have lived if he had decided differently. He wrote their names in the letter: Marcus Rodriguez, James Thompson. He wrote that he thought about their faces every single day for 10 years. He wrote that the guilt was eating him alive from the inside out, that he could not sleep, could not close his eyes without seeing them. Elena opened her eyes and looked at her father. He wrote that he wanted Ryan to grow up believing his father was a hero, that he did not want his son to know the truth, that he was asking me to protect that lie, to help build a myth around his death so that Ryan would have something to be proud of. Thomas was silent. His hands trembled against his thighs. "And I did it," Elena continued. Her voice was harder now, bitter. "I did exactly what he asked. I helped create the legend of Captain Daniel Beckett, the hero who died in Mogadishu. I let everyone believe the story because Daniel asked me to, because I loved him and I wanted to honor his last wish." She stood up abruptly and walked to the window. Outside, the grounds of the Veterans Center stretched away toward the tree line. Peaceful, serene, a carefully maintained illusion of tranquility. "But Daniel did not die in Mogadishu," she said. "He came home. He lived for another 10 years. He got married, had a son, built a career. And the whole time the guilt was destroying him. The PTSD was destroying him, and none of us did anything to help because we all believed the same lie he did. That Beckett's do not break. That showing weakness is failure. That real men handle their demons alone." Thomas's voice came from behind her, weaker now, fragile. "What happened at Benning, Elena? You have never told me the details. I have only heard the official report." Elena pressed her hand against the cold glass of the window. The morning sun warmed her face, but she felt cold inside. Ice cold. She had never spoken these words out loud. Not to anyone. Not in over 20 years. But Thomas was right. Secrets buried too long became poison, and she had been poisoned for too long already. "It was a Tuesday morning," she said, March 4th, 2003. "I was a lieutenant assigned to the training command at Benning. Daniel was a major by then, one of the senior instructors at Ranger School. We had lunch together every week, usually on Wednesdays. But that Tuesday, I had a feeling. Something told me I needed to see him. So I walked over to his office without calling ahead." She paused. Her throat felt tight. The memories were rising now, breaking through the walls she had built around them. Over 20 years of carefully maintained control, crumbling like sand. His office door was closed, the lights were on. I knocked, but he did not answer. I knocked again. Nothing, so I tried the handle and it was unlocked. Her voice dropped to a whisper. He was sitting behind his desk, still in his uniform. His eyes were open, but they were not seeing anything. There was a pistol in his right hand. On the desk in front of him, there were two things: a photograph of Ryan as a baby and a letter with my name on it. Thomas made a sound behind her, a sound of grief too deep for words. Elena kept her hand pressed against the window, using the cold glass to anchor herself to the present. I stood there for a long time. I do not know how long. Minutes. Hours. Time stopped making sense. I read the letter. Then I read it again. Then I put it in my pocket and called the military police. She turned to face her father. "The official report says that Major Daniel Beckett died of a self-inflicted gunshot wound. Cause unknown. No note was found." That is what it says because that is what I told them. I told them there was no note. I lied to protect his last wish, to protect the legend he wanted Ryan to believe. Thomas's face was wet with tears now. The tremors in his hands had worsened. His whole body shook with the effort of containing grief that had been building for 2 decades. Elena felt her own composure cracking. The walls were down now. The dam had broken, and the flood was coming whether she wanted it to or not. She crossed the room and knelt beside her father's chair. She took his trembling hands in hers. "I have carried that letter for over 20 years, she said. "I have read it so many times I have it memorized. And every time I see Ryan, I think about what Daniel asked me to do. Protect the myth. Let his son believe the lie. Let him grow up thinking his father was a hero who died in battle instead of a broken man who died alone in an office at Fort Benning with a pistol in his hand." Thomas gripped her hands with what strength he had left. "You have been carrying this alone," he said. His voice was barely audible. "All this time. You never told anyone." Elena shook her head. "I could not. I promised Daniel. I made a promise to a dead man, and I kept it. Even when it cost me everything. Even when the weight of it nearly broke me too." She leaned forward and rested her forehead against her father's hands. "But Ryan is asking questions now. He knows something is wrong. He knows the story does not add up. And I do not know if I can keep lying to him. I do not know if I should keep lying to him." Thomas was quiet for a long moment. When he spoke again, his voice had changed. Stronger, more certain. The voice of the man who had survived 14 months of hell and emerged unbroken. "Daniel was wrong to ask you to carry this burden alone," he said. "He was wrong to put that weight on your shoulders. And I was wrong to let you carry it without asking what it was. We both failed you, Elena. My son and me both." He lifted her chin with his trembling fingers, forcing her to meet his eyes. "But we can make it right, or at least we can try. Ryan deserves the truth, not the myth. The truth. The whole ugly, complicated truth about his father and what really happened and why." Elena felt something release inside her chest. Something that had been clenched tight for over 20 years finally let go. "It will destroy him," she whispered. "Finding out his father was not a hero. Finding out his father took his own life. Finding out that everything he believes about the Beckett legacy is a lie." Thomas shook his head slowly. "It might destroy the man he is now. The arrogant, entitled man who tried to take your weapon in front of 100 soldiers. But it might also build something better. Something stronger. Something real." He wiped his eyes with the back of his trembling hand. "That is what truth does, Elena. It destroys what is false and makes room for what is real. And Ryan needs something real to believe in. Not a myth, not a legend, a real example of what it means to struggle and fail and get back up and keep going." He looked at her with eyes that held decades of wisdom earned through suffering. "That is what you are, Elena. Not a myth, not a ghost, a real person who has faced real darkness and found a way through. That is the example Ryan needs. Not his father's legend, your reality." Elena stayed on her knees beside his chair for a long time. The morning light moved across the floor as the sun climbed higher. The sounds of the Veterans Center filtered through the walls. Voices, footsteps, the distant beep of medical equipment. A world continuing to turn while two people sat in a small room and grieved for all the things that might have been. Finally, Elena stood. She leaned down and kissed her father's forehead. "I will talk to Ryan," she said. "I will tell him the truth. All of it." Thomas nodded. His hands continued to tremble. His body continued to betray him. But his eyes were clear, resolute. "Start with the letter," he said. "Show him what Daniel wrote. Let him read his father's words. Then tell him your story. Tell him about Korengal, about what you survived, about what you carry. Let him see that strength is not about being unbreakable. It is about being broken and continuing anyway." Elena moved toward the door. She paused with her hand on the handle and looked back at the man who had saved her life decades ago by giving her a home and a name and a reason to live. "I love you, Papa." Thomas's voice was thick with emotion. "I love you too, daughter. I always have. From the moment I first saw you. The little girl with the serious eyes who refused to cry, even when crying was all she wanted to do. You were a warrior even then. You just did not know it yet." Elena nodded. Then she opened the door and walked out into the hallway. The walls were lined with photographs of veterans, faces from every era, every war, every corner of the American military experience. She walked past them without seeing them, her mind already at Fort Liberty, already rehearsing the conversation she would have with Ryan. A conversation that would change everything. A conversation that was over 20 years overdue. 300 miles away, Private Ryan Beckett was making a decision that would accelerate everything. He had spent the night in a state of tormented wakefulness. The conversation with Sergeant Webb played over and over in his mind. The questions without answers. The hints at secrets too terrible to speak. The implication that everything he knew about his family was incomplete at best, false at worst. By dawn, he had reached a conclusion. He was going to find out the truth, one way or another, with or without permission. He knew where Elena's quarters were located. He had learned that much during his first week at Fort Liberty before he knew who she was. Senior NCO housing. Building 7, room 312. The information had been meaningless then. Now it felt like a key. He waited until 0800 when the base was fully awake and active, when another soldier walking between buildings would draw no particular attention. Then he put on his uniform and walked out of the barracks. The morning was hot already, Carolina summer pressing down like a weight. Ryan moved through the familiar streets of the base, past the motor pool and the commissary and the headquarters building where the flags snapped in the humid breeze. Building 7 was a two-story structure of brick and concrete, identical to a dozen other buildings on the base. The senior NCOs lived here, the lifers, the men and women who had made the Army their home. The entrance required a key card, but a sergeant held the door for Ryan without looking twice at his rank. Professional courtesy, one soldier helping another. Room 312 was at the end of the second-floor hallway. Ryan stood outside the door for a long moment, his heart pounding, his palms slick with sweat. He was not sure what he was going to do. Break in, wait for her to return, leave a note. He tried the handle. It was unlocked. The room was empty. She was not there. But the door was open and Ryan's desperation was stronger than his judgment. He stepped inside. The room was Spartan, military neat. A bed made with precision, corners tucked tight enough to bounce a quarter. A desk against one wall, bare except for a lamp and a laptop. A photograph on the nightstand, the same photograph that sat in his barracks, the same photograph that sat in his grandfather's room in Virginia. And a footlocker at the end of the bed. Ryan knew he should not open it, knew that what he was doing was wrong, possibly criminal, definitely a betrayal of every principle he claimed to believe in. But the questions were eating him alive. The secrets were poison, and he had to know. He knelt beside the footlocker and lifted the lid. Inside, he found the carefully organized possessions of a life spent in service. Dress uniforms wrapped in plastic, medals displayed in velvet cases, photographs in protective sleeves, official documents in manila folders. And at the bottom, wrapped in a cloth that had once been white but had yellowed with age, a single envelope. Ryan's hands were trembling as he lifted it out. The envelope was old. The paper was fragile. On the front, in handwriting he did not recognize, was a single word. Elena. He knew what this was, knew it in his bones before he opened it. This was the secret. This was the truth that Webb had hinted at. This was the answer to the questions that had tormented him through the longest night of his life. He opened the envelope and began to read. The letter was dated March 4th, 2003. The handwriting was neat at first, but grew increasingly unsteady as the pages progressed. The words were addressed to Elena, but Ryan knew they were meant for him too, meant for anyone who needed to understand what had happened and why. Dear Elena, if you are reading this, then I have finally done what I have been thinking about doing for the past 10 years. I am sorry. I am sorry for leaving this burden on your shoulders. I am sorry for not being strong enough to carry it myself. I am sorry for everything. I need you to understand why. Not so you can forgive me. I do not deserve forgiveness. But so you can explain it to Ryan someday, when he is old enough to understand, when he needs to know who his father really was. I was never the man everyone thought I was. Not the hero, not the legend. I was just a man who made a decision in the middle of chaos and got it wrong. Mogadishu, October 3rd, 1993. The battle that everyone remembers. The battle that made movies and books and legends out of ordinary men who did extraordinary things. I was there. I led a team of Rangers into the city. And when everything went wrong, when the Blackhawks went down and the streets turned into kill zones, I had to make a choice. We were pinned down, taking fire from 3 directions. I had 2 options. Send Rodriguez and Thompson left to flank the enemy position, or pull everyone back and try to find another route. Both options had risks. Both options meant some of my men might die. I chose to send them left. Rodriguez and Thompson did exactly what I ordered. They moved fast and low, using the buildings for cover. They almost made it, almost. But almost is not good enough when bullets are flying. They were cut down 20 feet from their objective. I watched them die, Elena. I watched them fall, and there was nothing I could do. And in that moment, I knew that I had made the wrong choice, that if I had chosen differently, they might still be alive. The battle ended. We extracted. The official reports called it a victory of sorts. We accomplished our mission, more or less. But Rodriguez and Thompson were dead, and I was the one who killed them. Not the enemy, me, my decision, my order. I came home a hero. That is what everyone said. Captain Daniel Beckett, who led his Rangers through hell and brought most of them back alive. They gave me a medal. They promoted me. They talked about me like I was something special. But I knew the truth, and the truth has been eating me alive for 10 years. I cannot sleep, Elena. Every time I close my eyes, I see their faces. Rodriguez had a daughter who was born 3 days after he died. Thompson was engaged to a woman he had known since high school. They had lives. They had futures. And I took all of that away with one bad decision in the middle of a firefight. I have tried to live with it. I have tried therapy and medication and prayer and everything else the doctors recommended. But nothing works. The guilt does not fade. It just gets heavier. Every day, a little heavier. I cannot carry it anymore. I know what this will do to Sarah, to Ryan, to you. And I am sorry. I am sorry for all the pain I am about to cause. But I cannot keep pretending to be someone I am not. I cannot keep living as the hero when I know I am the villain. Please do not tell Ryan the truth, not the whole truth. Let him grow up believing his father was a good man who died serving his country. Let him have that myth to believe in. He will need something to hold on to, and the truth is too ugly, too complicated, too real. You are the strongest person I know, Elena. Stronger than Dad, even though he would never admit it. You survived what happened to your parents. You survived everything that came after. You will survive this too. Take care of my son. Help him grow up to be better than I was. Better than the myth and the man beneath it. I love you, little sister. I always have. I am sorry I was not strong enough. Daniel. Ryan read the letter 3 times. By the second reading, his hands were shaking so badly that the paper rattled. By the third reading, tears were streaming down his face. Everything he believed was a lie. His father was not a hero who died in battle. His father was a broken man who died by his own hand in an office at Fort Benning. His father was not a legend. His father was a person who had made a terrible mistake and spent 10 years being destroyed by guilt. And Elena had known. For over 20 years, Elena had known. She had helped build the myth. She had protected the lie. She had looked Ryan in the eyes countless times over the years and never said a word. The grief hit him first. Grief for the father he had lost twice. Once in death and again in truth. Grief for the man Daniel had been before Mogadishu broke him. Grief for all the years he had spent believing in something that was not real. Then the anger came. It rose up from somewhere deep inside him, hot and violent and overwhelming. Anger at Daniel for leaving. Anger at Thomas for raising a son who could not ask for help. Anger at a system that called broken men heroes and sent them back into the world without the support they needed. And anger at Elena. She had known. She had always known. And she had said nothing. She had watched Ryan grow up chasing a ghost, trying to live up to a man who never existed, building his entire identity around a lie. Ryan stood up. The letter crumpled in his fist. His tears had dried, replaced by something harder, something colder. He heard the door open behind him. He did not turn around. He did not need to. He knew who it was. Elena's voice was quiet, calm, the same tone she had used in the armory when she put him on the ground. I was going to tell you, she said. I drove here to tell you. I was going to show you that letter myself. Ryan finally turned to face her. His aunt, his father's sister, the woman who had protected a lie for his entire life. Over 20 years, he said, his voice shook with barely controlled rage. Over 20 years, you have known the truth about my father. And you said nothing. Elena stood in the doorway. Her face was unreadable. Her posture was controlled. But her eyes held something he had never seen before. Pain. Deep, unhealed pain. Daniel asked me to protect you, she said. He asked me to let you believe the myth. The myth? Ryan's voice rose. His hands clenched at his sides. My entire life has been built on a lie, and you call it a myth? He took a step toward her. I spent my whole life trying to live up to a man who never existed. I joined the army to be like him. I told everyone I met about my hero father. I built my whole identity around being a Beckett, around carrying on the legacy. And the whole time, you knew it was fake. You knew, and you said nothing. Elena did not flinch. She stood her ground, absorbing his anger like she had absorbed so many other forms of pain over the years. I did what your father asked me to do, she said. I made a promise to a dying man, and I kept it. He is not a dying man, Ryan spat. He is a man who gave up. He is a man who could not handle his own guilt, so he took his own life and left everyone else to pick up the pieces. The words hung in the air between them. Ugly, brutal, true. Elena's expression finally changed. Something flickered across her face. Something that might have been grief. something that might have been anger, something that might have been both. "You do not understand," she said. Her voice was harder now. "You do not understand what Mogadishu did to him. What it was like to make a decision in the middle of combat and watch men die because of it. You have never had to carry that weight." Ryan laughed bitterly. "And whose fault is that? You kept me wrapped in cotton my whole life, protected me from the truth. Let me believe in fairy tales instead of reality." He crumpled the letter tighter in his fist. "I am done," he said. "I am done with the lies. I am done with this family and its secrets. I am done trying to be something I never had a chance of being because the thing I was trying to be never existed in the first place." He pushed past her toward the door. Elena's voice stopped him. "Your grandfather wants to see you." Ryan paused. His back was to her. "He is at the Veterans Center in Virginia," she continued. "He wants to tell you about Korengal, about what I did there, about what really happened and why it matters." Ryan turned his head slightly, not quite looking at her, not quite looking away. "Why would I care about Korengal?" "Because that is where I learned that your father was wrong. That is where I learned that strength is not about carrying your burdens alone. That is where I learned that asking for help is not weakness, it is survival." She stepped toward him. "Your father broke because he thought he had to be perfect. Because he thought that making a mistake meant he was a failure. Because he thought that real men suffer in silence. He was wrong about all of it, and he died because of how wrong he was." Her voice softened. "I almost made the same mistake, Ryan. After Daniel died, after Korengal, I almost broke the same way he did, but someone helped me. Someone taught me that being wounded does not mean being weak, that the scars we carry can make us stronger if we let them." Ryan stood motionless. The anger was still there, burning in his chest, but beneath it, something else was stirring, something that felt almost like curiosity. "Who?" he asked. His voice was rough. "Who taught you that?" Elena was quiet for a moment. When she answered, her voice was barely above a whisper. "The men I served with in Korengal, the ones who lived and the ones who died. They taught me that real strength comes from connection, not isolation. From admitting when you are struggling, not pretending everything is fine." She reached out and gently took the crumpled letter from his hand. "Your father never learned that lesson, and it killed him. I do not want the same thing to happen to you." Ryan looked at her, really looked at her for the first time since the armory. He saw the scar running down her face. He saw the lines around her eyes that spoke of sleepless nights and hard choices. He saw the way she carried herself, the coiled readiness that never quite relaxed. He saw a woman who had been carrying impossible burdens for decades and was still standing. The anger did not disappear, but it shifted slightly, made room for something else. "Virginia," he said. "You said my grandfather is in Virginia?" Elena nodded. "The Veterans Center outside Richmond. He has been waiting for this conversation for a long time." She moved past him toward the door. "Get your things," she said. "We are driving up tonight. Your grandfather will tell you about Korengal, and then you can decide what kind of man you want to be. A man like your father, who carried his pain alone until it destroyed him, or a man like your grandfather, who learned too late that asking for help is the bravest thing a soldier can do." She paused in the doorway. "Or maybe something else entirely, something new, something that has not been tried before." Ryan stood alone in her room for a long moment after she left. The morning light streamed through the window. The footlocker stood open beside the bed. The photograph of his grandfather and his aunt watched him from the nightstand. He thought about his father, about the man he had believed in, and the man who had actually existed, about the myth and the reality beneath it. He thought about the letter, about the weight of guilt that had crushed Daniel Beckett over 10 long years, about the decision to end the pain rather than seek help. He thought about Elena, about the secrets she had carried, about the promise she had kept even when keeping it cost her everything. And he thought about himself, about the arrogant man who had walked into that armory believing that legacy was enough, believing that blood made him special, believing that the Beckett name would carry him through any challenge without effort. That man was dead now, killed by a letter and a truth and a woman who moved faster than sight. The question was, what would rise in his place? Ryan walked to the door. He did not know the answer yet, but for the first time in his life, he was ready to find out. Virginia was waiting, and so were the ghosts of Korengal. The drive from Fort Liberty to Virginia took 6 hours through the Carolina night. Elena drove. Ryan sat in the passenger seat, staring out the window at the darkness streaming past, saying nothing. The silence between them was thick with everything that remained unspoken. The letter, the truth about Daniel, The 22 years of lies that had finally come crashing down. Ryan's anger had settled into something colder during the hours on the road. Something harder. Something that felt less like fire and more like ice. They arrived at the Virginia Veterans Care Center just after midnight. The building was quiet at this hour, the hallways dim with emergency lighting, the night staff moving like shadows between rooms. Elena signed them in at the front desk and led Ryan through corridors he had never walked before, toward a room he had never visited. Thomas Beckett was awake when they entered. He sat in his chair by the window, silhouetted against the glow of parking lot lights filtering through the glass. His hands trembled in his lap. His shoulders were bent forward slightly, the posture of a man fighting a battle against his own body. But when he turned to face them, his eyes were sharp, clear, the eyes of a warrior who had never truly stopped fighting. "Ryan," he said. His voice shook with the tremors that plagued his speech now, but the word carried weight. Authority. The command presence of a man who had led soldiers through hell and back. Ryan stood frozen in the doorway. He had not seen his grandfather in nearly a year. The changes were stark. The tremors, the weight loss, the way Thomas gripped the arms of his chair to steady himself. But more than the physical changes, Ryan saw something else. Something he had never noticed before. In the lines of his grandfather's face, in the depths of his eyes, Ryan saw the same exhaustion he had seen described in his father's letter. The weariness of a man who had carried too much for too long. "Grandpa," Ryan said. His voice came out rougher than he intended. Thomas gestured toward the chair across from him. "Sit down, son. We have a lot to talk about, things I should have told you years ago." Ryan crossed the room slowly. He felt Elena move to stand by the window, her presence a quiet anchor in the corner of his vision. He sat in the chair across from his grandfather and waited. Thomas was silent for a long moment. His hands continued to tremble. Outside, the night pressed against the windows like a living thing. "Elena tells me you found Daniel's letter," Thomas said finally. Ryan nodded. He didn't trust his voice. "Then you know the truth about your father. The real truth. Not the story we told you." Ryan's jaw tightened. "I know he killed himself. I know he lied to everyone for 10 years about what happened in Mogadishu. I know my whole life has been built on a myth." Thomas shook his head slowly. "Not a myth, son, a shield. We built that story to protect you, to give you something to believe in while you were growing up. Your father wanted you to have a hero to look up to, even if that hero never really existed. And you think that makes it better?" Ryan's voice rose despite his efforts to control it. "You think lying to me for 22 years was protecting me?" Thomas met his grandson's anger with steady eyes. "No, I think it was a mistake. One of many mistakes I've made over the years. But I'm not here to defend what we did. I'm here to tell you the rest of the story. The parts you don't know yet. The parts that might help you understand why we made the choices we made." He paused, gathering his thoughts. Or perhaps gathering his courage. "I'm here to tell you about Korengal. About what Elena went through over there. About what she carries inside her every single day. Because if you want to understand this family, if you want to understand what it really means to be a Beckett, you need to hear her story." He looked toward the window where Elena stood motionless. "Tell him," he said. "Tell him everything." Elena didn't move for a long moment. Her silhouette remained still against the dim light from outside. When she finally spoke, her voice was different than Ryan had ever heard it. Softer, more human. Less like the ghost and more like the woman beneath the legend. "Korengal Valley," she said, "Eastern Afghanistan, summer of 2019. She turned to face them, her features half lit by the glow from the parking lot. "I was 36 years old. A captain by then, assigned to a joint training mission. 8 of us total. American advisors embedded with Afghan National Army units. Our job was to train local forces in advanced tactics, counterinsurgency, small unit operations. The kind of work that doesn't make headlines but wins wars." She moved to sit on the edge of Thomas's bed, her eyes fixed on some distant point that only she could see. "Our team was solid, experienced. I had handpicked every one of them. Staff Sergeant Marcus Webb was my senior NCO. 47 years old, 3 previous deployments. The steadiest man under fire I've ever known. Sergeant First Class Kevin Chen was our communications specialist. 38, married, one daughter back home. A man who never raised his voice but could make a radio do things the manufacturers never intended." Her voice caught slightly on the name. Kevin Chen. She paused and Ryan saw something flicker across her face. Pain. old pain that had never fully healed. We were stationed at a small outpost in the valley, Fire Base Phoenix. Nothing fancy. Some concrete barriers, a few buildings, a landing zone for helicopter resupply. The kind of place that exists on no tourist maps and appears only in classified reports in the nightmares of men who served there. She clasped her hands together in her lap. Korengal was called the Valley of Death for a reason. More American casualties per capita than anywhere else in the Afghan theater. The terrain was impossible. Mountains on every side, covered in dense forest, riddled with caves and trails that the enemy knew better than we ever could. They had been fighting invaders in those mountains for centuries. We were just the latest in a long line. Thomas reached out and touched her arm. His hand trembled against her sleeve. Elena looked at him. Something passed between them, an understanding forged over decades of shared history. Then she continued. It happened on a Tuesday night, August 14th, 2019. We had been at Phoenix for 6 weeks. Training operations were going well. The Afghan units were making progress. We had started to believe that maybe, just maybe, we would complete the mission without major incident. Her voice hardened. We were wrong. The attack came at 02:30. No warning. One moment the outpost was quiet, the guards at their posts, the rest of us sleeping in our bunks. The next moment the world exploded. RPGs hit the western barrier first, 3 of them in rapid succession. The concussions shook the buildings like earthquakes. Then the small arms fire started, heavy, sustained, coming from at least 4 different positions in the hills above us. She stood up abruptly and walked to the window. Her reflection stared back at her from the dark glass. I was out of my bunk in seconds. Training takes over in moments like that. You don't think, you react. I grabbed my rifle, my vest, my helmet. I was out the door and moving toward the command post before my conscious mind fully registered what was happening. The outpost was chaos. Muzzle flashes lit up the darkness from every direction. Tracers streaked overhead like angry fireflies. Men were shouting, running, taking cover behind whatever protection they could find. The Afghan soldiers we had been training were fighting back, but they were scattered, disorganized, caught off guard like the rest of us. Her hands clenched at her sides. Within the first 5 minutes, we had 3 wounded, 2 Afghan soldiers and 1 of my own. Specialist Torres took shrapnel to the leg from an RPG that detonated against the motor pool. He couldn't walk, could barely move. We dragged him into the command post and applied a tourniquet, but he needed evacuation, needed a hospital, needed more than we could give him in the middle of a firefight. I got on the radio to call for support, medevac, air support, anything. But the response I got back was the worst thing I could have heard. She turned to face Ryan. All assets committed. Estimated arrival time, 90 minutes minimum. 90 minutes. In a firefight, 90 seconds can feel like a lifetime. 90 minutes was an eternity. We were on our own. Ryan sat motionless in his chair, transfixed by the story unfolding before him. He had heard about Korengal. Everyone in the army had, but hearing about it was nothing like seeing it reflected in Elena's eyes. The attack intensified around the 30-minute mark, she continued. They were probing our defenses, looking for weak points, testing our response. The eastern barrier was taking the heaviest fire. We had men there, good men, holding the line. But they were running low on ammunition, running low on options. She walked back to the bed and sat down again. That's when Kevin Chen came to me. Her voice changed when she said his name. Softer, heavier, weighted with something that Ryan recognized from his father's letter. Survivor's guilt. Kevin was calm. He was always calm. That was his gift. In the middle of absolute chaos, Kevin Chen was the eye of the storm. He walked up to me while bullets were snapping overhead and rounds were impacting all around us. And he spoke like we were having a conversation over coffee. Captain, he said, we need to get the wounded out. Torres won't make it another hour without proper medical care. The Afghan casualties are even worse. We need to evacuate. I told him what I already knew, that evacuation was 90 minutes out, that we had to hold until then. He shook his head. He said, 90 minutes is too long, but there might be another way. Elena's eyes closed for a moment. Kevin had been studying the terrain since we arrived. He knew those hills better than anyone except the enemy. He told me about a trail, a goat path, really. It wound through a ravine on the south side of the outpost, emerged about a kilometer away at a position where helicopters could land safely. If we could get the wounded to that position, if we could hold it long enough for extraction, we might save them. But there was a problem. The trail was exposed. Anyone moving along it would be visible from the enemy positions above. The only way to get the wounded out was to create a diversion. Draw fire away from the south side. Keep the enemy focused on the main outcome while a small team slipped away with the casualties. She opened her eyes. I knew what he was suggesting. He wanted to stay behind with a handful of men. Hold the outpost, draw fire. Buy time for the rest of us to get the wounded to safety. It was a suicide mission. We both knew it. Ryan's throat tightened. He saw where this was going. He saw the impossible choice that Elena had faced. I told Kevin no, Elena said. I told him I wouldn't order any of my people to stay behind in a fight they couldn't win. I told him we would hold together or die together. He looked at me with those calm eyes of his, and he said something I will never forget as long as I live. He said, Captain, I'm not asking for an order. I'm volunteering. This is my choice. I've got a wife and a daughter back home. If I die tonight, I want it to mean something. I want them to know their husband and father gave his life to save others. That's worth more than any medal. That's worth more than coming home. Elena's voice cracked. He said, get the wounded out, get my men home, and tell my daughter that her father loved her more than anything in this world. She wiped her eyes with the back of her hand, a gesture Ryan had never seen her make, a crack in the armor that she had worn for so long. I didn't want to leave him. I argued, I begged. I tried to find another way. But Kevin was right. The math was simple. Stay together and everyone dies. Split up and some of us might live. So I made the call. Kevin stayed at the outpost with 3 other volunteers. Webb was one of them. They held the eastern barrier, drew fire, made noise, made the enemy think the main force was still dug in and fighting. I took the wounded and the rest of the team down the trail. Torres on a stretcher, 2 Afghan soldiers who could barely walk. 4 of us carrying them, half running, half crawling through the darkness while the sounds of battle echoed behind us. She was silent for a moment. The weight of the memory pressed down on her shoulders like a physical burden. We made it to the extraction point. The helicopters arrived 20 minutes later. We loaded the wounded and flew out. She looked at Ryan, and then I went back. Ryan blinked. What? I went back, Elena repeated. As soon as the wounded were on the birds, I grabbed a rifle and ammunition from one of the crew chiefs and I ran him back down that trail. Back toward the outpost, back toward Kevin and Webb and the men I had left behind. The helicopter pilot thought I was crazy. He was probably right, but I couldn't leave them. I couldn't fly away while my people were fighting and dying. That's not who I am. That's not what Thomas Beckett raised me to be. She glanced at her father. Thomas's face was wet with tears, but he said nothing. His trembling hands gripped the arms of his chair. By the time I got back to the outpost, the fighting had shifted. The enemy had realized that the main force had withdrawn. They were moving in for the kill. The last defenders were falling back toward the center of the compound, out of ammunition, out of options. I found Webb first. He was behind what was left of the motor pool, bleeding from a wound in his shoulder, firing the last rounds in his magazine. I gave him my spare ammo and we pushed forward together. The outpost was almost overrun. Enemy fighters had breached the barriers. They were inside the compound, moving between buildings, hunting for survivors. We found Kevin in the command bunker. Her voice dropped to a whisper. He was still alive. Barely. He had taken a round through the abdomen during the fighting. He was lying against the wall, his rifle empty, his hands pressed against the wound in his stomach. When he saw me, he smiled. He said, "You came back." I told him, of course I came back. I told him we were getting out of here. I told him the helicopters were on their way. He just shook his head. He knew. He knew he wasn't going to make it. The wound was too severe. We were too far from surgical care. Even if the helicopters arrived that instant, it would be too late. Elena's eyes were fixed on the floor now. That's when they found us. 3 enemy fighters. They came through the door of the bunker while I was trying to stop Kevin's bleeding. Webb was outside, holding the perimeter. It was just me and 3 men with rifles in a concrete box 20 feet square. I didn't have time to think. Didn't have time to reach for my weapon. They were too close. The first one was already raising his rifle. She held up her hands, her fingers spread. I moved on instinct. Pure training. Thomas's voice in my head from 30 years of practice. Speed is less important than precision. A properly executed technique will work regardless of size or strength. The first one went down before he could fire. Joint lock, disarm. The crack of his elbow breaking was louder than the gunfire outside. I used his body as a shield, drove forward into the second, took him to the ground, my knee to his throat. He stopped moving. The third one got a shot off. Wild. It missed me by inches and ricocheted off the concrete wall. I felt something hit my back. Sharp, hot, like being stabbed with a heated poker. But I didn't stop. Couldn't stop. The third fighter was trying to bring his rifle around. I was faster. One strike to the throat, one to the temple. He went down and didn't get up. She lowered her hands. 3 men, maybe 15 seconds. I don't really remember. The details blurred together in moments like that. What I remember is the silence afterward, the ringing in my ears, the smell of blood and cordite, and Kevin's voice weak and fading. He said, "You did it, Captain. You got them." I crawled back to him, took his hand. His grip was weak, getting weaker. He said, "Tell my daughter. Tell her I love her." And then he was gone. The room was silent except for the hum of medical equipment down the hallway. Ryan sat frozen, his anger forgotten, his heart aching with the weight of what Elena had just shared. Thomas's trembling hand found Elena's. "Webb found me an hour later," Elena continued. "The helicopters had finally arrived. The enemy had withdrawn. The battle was over. I was still sitting next to Kevin's body, holding his hand. The wound in my back had started to seep through my uniform, but I didn't feel it. Didn't feel anything except the cold. They put me on a stretcher and flew me to Bagram. The doctors told me I had taken shrapnel from the ricochet, a piece of bullet jacket. It lodged against my spine, 2 centimeters from permanent paralysis. She touched her back unconsciously. They wanted to operate, remove it. But the surgery was risky, 50-50 chance of success, 50-50 chance of spending the rest of my life in a wheelchair. I told them to leave it. Brian's eyes widened. "Leave it? You still have shrapnel in your back?" Elena nodded. 2 centimeters from my spinal cord. "It moves sometimes, shifts when I train too hard, when I push my body the way I push the soldiers I teach. Some days the pain is manageable. Some days it's not, but I've learned to live with it, learned to hide it, because showing pain would mean admitting weakness. And weakness isn't something Elena Mercer is allowed to show." She looked at Thomas. "That's what you taught me, Papa. That's the lesson I learned in your house. Becketts don't show weakness. Becketts carry their burdens alone. Becketts never ask for help." Thomas's face crumpled. "I was wrong to teach you that," he said. His voice was thick with emotion. "Wrong to teach Daniel. Wrong about everything that matters." "I know," Elena said softly. "I know you were wrong, but knowing something is wrong and unlearning it are 2 different things. It took me years to understand that. Years of carrying Kevin's death. Years of hiding the pain in my back. Years of pretending to be something I'm not." She turned to Ryan. "That's why I never told you about your father. Not just because Daniel asked me to protect you, but because I believed the same lie he believed. The lie that Thomas believed before him. The lie that says real strength means suffering alone." Her eyes held his. "Your father broke because he thought he had to be perfect. He thought making a mistake in Mogadishu meant he was a failure. He thought carrying his guilt in silence was the noble thing to do. And when the weight became too much, when he couldn't carry it anymore, he had no one to turn to. Because Becketts don't ask for help. Becketts handle their own problems. Becketts die before they show weakness." She leaned forward. "I almost made the same mistake, Ryan. After Korengal, I came back broken in more ways than one. The shrapnel in my back, the guilt of leaving Kevin behind, the faces of the 3 men I killed with my bare hands. I carried all of it alone because that's what I was taught to do. And I nearly ended up like Daniel." Ryan felt something shift inside his chest. The ice that had formed around his heart began to crack. "What stopped you?" he asked quietly. Elena was silent for a moment. "Webb," she said finally. "Marcus Webb. He found me one night in my quarters at Bagram, 3 months after Korengal. I had my sidearm in my hand. I was thinking about all the reasons I should use it. He didn't lecture me, didn't quote regulations or threaten to report me. He just sat down beside me and told me his own story. About the men he lost in the Gulf War. About the nights he spent staring at the ceiling, wondering if he should have done something different. About the therapy he finally sought after years of pretending he was fine. He told me that asking for help wasn't weakness. It was survival. He told me that the men who died under my command wouldn't want me to join them. They would want me to live, to honor their sacrifice by becoming someone who could prevent others from dying the same way." She wiped her eyes again. "Webb saved my life that night. Not with a weapon or a medal or an order, just by being human, just by admitting that he was broken too. Just by showing me that strength isn't about being invincible. It's about being wounded and continuing anyway. Thomas's voice emerged from the silence. That's what I should have done for Daniel. What I failed to do. I saw the signs. I saw him struggling. But I was too proud, too afraid, too convinced that Beckett's handled their own problems to ask my own son if he was okay. He looked at Ryan with eyes full of regret. I won't make the same mistake with you. Ryan didn't know what to say. The anger that had driven him for the past day and a half had faded, replaced by something more complex. Grief and understanding in the beginning of something that might eventually become acceptance. Before he could respond, Elena's phone buzzed in her pocket. She pulled it out, glanced at the screen, and her expression changed. What is it? Thomas asked. Elena stood up. Her face had hardened into the mask that Ryan recognized from the armory. The ghost was back. It's Webb, she said. There's a problem at Fort Liberty. Something about Lieutenant Colonel Holt in my medical records. Thomas's eyes narrowed. Holt, I know that name. He was a candidate in the Ranger course I helped run 8 years ago. I failed him out for discipline violations. He never forgave me. She was already moving toward the door. He's been after my program for months, trying to get it shut down, trying to get me removed. But he's never had enough leverage. She paused at the doorway. Until now. If he's found my medical records, if he knows about the shrapnel, he can force a medical evaluation. And if the evaluation shows what I know it will show, I'll be medically discharged, forced into retirement. Everything I've built, everything I've worked for, gone. Ryan stood up. What can we do? Elena shook her head. This is my fight. You should stay here with Thomas. No. Ryan's voice was firm, firmer than he had intended. Elena turned to look at him. You just told me that the Beckett weakness is trying to handle everything alone, that asking for help isn't failure. So let me help. He crossed the room to stand beside her. I don't know what I can do. I'm just a private with 2 months in the Army, but I'm not going to sit here while someone tries to destroy your career. Not after everything you've told me. Not after everything you've survived. Elena studied his face for a long moment. Something in her expression shifted, softened. You're more like your father than you know, she said quietly. The good parts of him, the parts that made him volunteer for the hardest missions, the parts that made him care about his men more than himself. She glanced at Thomas. He's coming with me. Thomas nodded slowly. His hands trembled, but his voice was steady. I'm coming too. Elena's eyes widened. Papa, you can't. The drive alone would be too much. Your condition is mine to manage, Thomas interrupted. He gripped the arms of his chair and with visible effort pushed himself to his feet. His legs shook. His whole body trembled. But he stood. I spent 14 months in a prison camp refusing to give up. I survived torture that was designed to break me. I'm not going to let Parkinson's disease or a 6-hour drive stop me from defending my daughter. He looked at Elena with eyes that burned with the same fire that had kept him alive 50 years ago. This is my fight too. Holt is attacking my family, my legacy, everything I've spent my life building. And I'll be damned if I let him win without looking him in the eye and showing him what a Beckett really looks like. Elena opened her mouth to argue, then closed it. She recognized that expression, had seen it in the mirror often enough. She nodded once. Then let's go. The drive back to Fort Liberty was faster than the drive up. Elena pushed the speed limit while Thomas dozed fitfully in the back seat and Ryan sat beside him, watching over his grandfather with new eyes. They arrived at the base just after dawn. The morning light painted the buildings in shades of gold and pink, a peaceful contrast to the storm that was about to break. Webb met them at the gate. His face was grim. Holt moved faster than we expected, he said. He's called a medical review board for 0900. Says he has evidence that you're unfit for duty, that you've been hiding a disabling injury. Elena's jaw tightened. Who's on the board? Colonel Patterson is presiding. Major Chen from Medical Services. Captain Williams from Personnel. Ryan caught the name. Chen. The same name as Kevin. The same name as... There's something else, Webb continued. He looked uncomfortable. Someone else showed up this morning, asking questions about Korengal, about you. Who? Webb hesitated. A private first class, young woman, name of Sarah Chen. Elena went still. Chen, Kevin's daughter. Webb nodded. She's been at Liberty for 3 months, training under your program. She found out yesterday who you are, who you were to her father. Elena closed her eyes. Of course. The universe had a cruel sense of timing. Where is she now? Waiting outside your office. She's been there since before sunrise. Elena took a breath. Then let's not keep her waiting. They walked through the base together. Thomas moved slowly, his trembling steps supported by Ryan on one side and Webb on the other. Soldiers they passed stopped and stared. Word had spread. The legendary Thomas Beckett was here. The Medal of Honor recipient. The man who had never broken. But Ryan saw what others didn't. He saw the effort it cost his grandfather to keep moving. The pain hidden behind the mask of determination. The humanity beneath the legend. They reached the building that housed Elena's office. And there, sitting on a bench outside the door, was a young woman in uniform. Private First Class Sarah Chen was 20 years old. She had her father's eyes, dark and calm and patient. She sat with her hands folded in her lap, watching them approach with an expression that Ryan couldn't read. Elena stopped a few feet away. Private Chen. The young woman stood. Her posture was perfect. Her face was controlled. But her eyes held something deeper. Master Sergeant Mercer, she paused. Or should I call you Captain Mercer? That was your rank when my father served under you. Elena didn't flinch. Yes, it was. Sarah nodded slowly. My mother told me stories about you, about the woman who led the mission where my father died. She said you were the bravest officer my father ever served with. She said he trusted you with his life. Elena's voice was quiet. I wish I had been worthy of that trust. Sarah's expression shifted. Something that might have been anger. Something that might have been grief. Something that was probably both. I spent years hating you, she said. Hating the faceless captain who got my father killed. Hating the army that sent him to that valley. Hating everyone and everything that took him away from me. She took a step forward. Then I joined the army myself, joined the combatives program, started learning from a woman named Ghost who moved faster than anyone I'd ever seen. A woman who pushed us harder than any other instructor. A woman who seemed to feel nothing, to fear nothing, to be made of something harder than human flesh. Her voice cracked. And then I found out who you really were. Elena stood motionless, waiting for the blow that she had been expecting for 5 years. The accusation, the condemnation, the blame that she deserved. But Sarah Chen didn't accuse, didn't condemn, didn't blame. Instead, she reached into her pocket and pulled out a folded piece of paper. My father wrote my mother a letter the day before he died, she said. She never showed it to me until last week. Until I told her I'd found out who you were. She unfolded the paper with trembling hands. He wrote that he was about to do something dangerous. Something that might cost him his life. But he said it was worth it. He said that if anything happened to him, my mother should find you. Captain Elena Mercer, he said you would understand. He said you would help. Sarah looked up from the letter. He wrote that you were the most honorable officer he ever served under. That you would never leave a soldier behind. That you would carry his memory the same way you carried your own burdens. With strength and silence and dignity. Her voice broke. He wrote that when I was old enough, I should find you, learn from you, become a warrior like you, because if there was anyone in the world who could teach me what it meant to serve with honor, it was you. Elena's composure finally cracked. Tears spilled down her cheeks. I couldn't save him, she whispered. I tried. I went back. I fought my way through to reach him, but I was too late. He died in my arms, and there was nothing I could do. Sarah stepped forward and did something that no one expected. She embraced Elena. I know, she said. I know you tried. I know you went back. Sergeant Webb told me the whole story. About the shrapnel in your back. About the men you killed with your bare hands trying to reach my father. About how you held him as he died. She pulled back and looked Elena in the eyes. My father didn't die alone. He died knowing that his captain had come back for him. That she didn't abandon him. That she loved her soldiers enough to risk everything. She wiped her own tears. I'm not here to blame you, Master Sergeant. I'm here to thank you and to tell you that whatever happens with Holt, whatever happens with the review board, you have at least one soldier who will stand beside you. Elena couldn't speak. 20 years of control, 20 years of armor, 20 years of being the ghost, and this young woman had broken through all of it with a letter from a dead man and words of forgiveness that Elena had never expected to hear. Thomas's trembling voice broke the silence. That's what it means to be a soldier. Not the fighting, not the killing, not the medals or the missions or the glory. It's about the people beside you. The ones you would die for, the ones who would die for you. He looked at his daughter, at his grandson, at the young woman who had lost her father in a valley half a world away. That's the legacy worth protecting. Ryan felt something change inside him. The last remnants of his anger dissolved, replaced by something clearer, purer, an understanding of what it meant to serve that had nothing to do with bloodlines or legends or names. Elena straightened. She wiped her face with the back of her hand and turned toward the building. The review board convenes in 1 hour, she said. Her voice was steady again. The ghost was back, but different now, tempered by the tears, strengthened by the support of the people around her. Holt thinks he can destroy everything I've built. He thinks he can use my wounds against me. She looked at Thomas. Let's show him what a Beckett really looks like. The conference room was cold. Industrial air conditioning hummed from vents in the ceiling, pushing frigid air across the long table where the review board sat. Colonel Patterson presided, a man in his 50s with a face that revealed nothing. Beside him sat Major Chen from Medical Services and Captain Williams from Personnel. Lieutenant Colonel Victor Holt stood at the front of the room, a folder of documents in his hands. He was 48 years old, fit and polished, with the confident posture of a man who believed he had already won. The door opened and Elena walked in. She was not alone. Behind her came Thomas Beckett, moving slowly but steadily, his trembling hand gripping a cane that Webb had found for him somewhere. Behind Thomas came Ryan, in full uniform, his face set with determination. Behind Ryan came Sarah Chen, standing at attention. And behind Sarah came a stream of soldiers that filled the back of the room. Men and women who had trained under Elena, who had learned from her, who had become warriors because of her. Word had spread. The ghost was under attack, and her soldiers had come to defend her. Holt's expression flickered. This was not what he had expected. Colonel Patterson looked at the crowd with raised eyebrows. This is a closed hearing, he said. Only authorized personnel are permitted. Thomas's trembling voice cut through the room. With respect, Colonel, I am authorized personnel. Command Sergeant Major Thomas Beckett, retired. Medal of Honor recipient, and father of the soldier you're about to evaluate. Patterson's eyes widened. He recognized the name. Everyone recognized the name. Sergeant Major Beckett, this is unexpected. Thomas moved to the front of the room. His cane tapped against the floor with each step. His body shook with tremors, but his eyes were steady, sharp. The eyes of a man who had faced worse than a review board and survived. I understand, he said, that Lieutenant Colonel Holt has raised concerns about my daughter's fitness for duty. Concerns based on a medical condition she has been carrying for 5 years. He turned to face Holt directly. I also understand that Lieutenant Colonel Holt was a candidate in a ranger course that my daughter helped administer 8 years ago, a course from which he was removed for discipline violations. Holt's face reddened. That's irrelevant to these proceedings. Is it? Thomas's voice strengthened. A man fails out of a course, spends 8 years nursing a grudge, finally finds a piece of information he can use against the woman who failed him. And you expect us to believe this is about fitness for duty? He gestured toward Elena. My daughter has shrapnel lodged 2 centimeters from her spine. She received that wound while fighting her way back to rescue soldiers she had been forced to leave behind. She received it in close quarters, combat against 3 enemy fighters who she killed with her bare hands. His voice filled the room. For 5 years, she has carried that wound. For 5 years, she has trained soldiers despite the pain. For 5 years, she has hidden her suffering because that is what she was taught to do. Because I taught her that showing weakness was failure. He looked at Patterson. That was my mistake, my failure as a father. But it is not evidence of unfitness for duty. It is evidence of the opposite. It is evidence of a warrior who puts her mission and her soldiers above her own comfort, above her own safety, above her own life. Thomas turned back to Holt. I spent 14 months as a prisoner of war. I was tortured 17 times. I have scars that never healed and nightmares that never stopped. By Lieutenant Colonel Holt's standard, I should have been discharged decades ago. But I wasn't discharged. I served 40 more years. I trained thousands of soldiers. I helped build the army that Lieutenant Colonel Holt now wears the uniform of. His trembling hand pointed at Holt. This man doesn't care about fitness for duty. He cares about revenge. He cares about destroying a woman who held him accountable for his own failures. And I will not stand by while he uses the wounds my daughter earned in combat to take away everything she has built. The room was silent. Colonel Patterson looked from Thomas to Holt to Elena. His face was thoughtful. Lieutenant Colonel Holt, he said slowly, do you have a response? Holt's jaw was tight. His confident posture had crumbled. The regulations are clear, he said. His voice was less certain now. A soldier with a disabling injury must undergo medical evaluation. I am simply following procedure. Thomas laughed. It was a harsh sound, a sound without humor. Procedure. You're hiding behind procedure to conduct a vendetta. You're using regulations designed to protect soldiers as a weapon against one. He stepped closer to Holt, close enough that the younger man took an involuntary step back. I've seen men like you my whole career. Men who care more about their own advancement than the soldiers they lead. Men who hold grudges and call it principle. Men who tear down others because they can't build anything themselves. His trembling hand rose and pointed at Holt's chest. You're not fit to wear that uniform. You're not fit to judge soldiers who have sacrificed more than you can imagine. And if this board has any integrity at all, they'll see through your petty revenge and dismiss this hearing for what it is. Thomas turned to Patterson. My daughter has served this country with honor for 20 years. She has saved lives. She has trained warriors. She has done more with shrapnel in her back than most soldiers do with perfect health. Don't let this man destroy her because he couldn't pass a course 8 years ago. The silence stretched. Patterson looked at the documents in front of him, looked at Holt, looked at Elena, looked at the crowd of soldiers standing at the back of the room. Then he spoke. This hearing is adjourned pending further review. He gathered his papers and stood. Lieutenant Colonel Holt, I suggest you consider carefully whether you want to pursue this matter further. And I suggest you do so knowing that Command Sergeant Major Beckett's statement will be part of the official record. He walked out of the room. Holt stood alone at the front, his face white with rage and humiliation. The soldiers at the back began to file out, many of them pausing to salute Thomas as they passed. Ryan watched his grandfather accept the salutes with dignity, despite the tremors that shook his body. He watched Elena stand tall, her composure restored, her honor defended. And he understood something that had eluded him his entire life. Legacy wasn't about blood. It wasn't about names. It wasn't about the stories you inherited or the myths you were taught to believe. Legacy was about what you did when it mattered, the choices you made, the people you defended, the principles you refused to compromise. Thomas Beckett had just shown him what a real Beckett looked like. And for the first time, Ryan wanted to be worthy of that example. 3 days after the review board hearing, Thomas Beckett made a phone call that would change everything. He sat in Elena's quarters at Fort Liberty, a blanket draped over his trembling legs despite the summer heat. The Parkinson's was worse today. The stress of the confrontation with Holt had taken its toll, and his hands shook so badly that he could barely hold the phone. But his voice was steady when the call connected. Jack, he said, it's Tom Beckett. The voice on the other end was rough with age but warm with recognition. Tom. Good God, it's been what, 15 years? I heard you were having some trouble down at Liberty. Thomas smiled grimly. News travels fast. When it involves you, it does. The man on the phone chuckled. What do you need? I need the brotherhood, Thomas said. I need everyone who's still breathing. Everyone who remembers what we went through. Everyone who owes me a favor or just wants to help an old soldier defend his family. There was a pause on the line. This about that medical review? The one they tried to spring on your daughter? It's about more than that, Thomas said. It's about a man named Holt who thinks he can destroy everything I've built because he couldn't pass a ranger course. It's about protecting the next generation from the kind of politics that has been rotting this army from the inside out. Another pause, longer this time. Give me 24 hours, the voice said. I'll make some calls. Thomas hung up and looked at Elena, who sat across from him with an expression of concern. Papa, what are you doing? What I should have done from the beginning, Thomas replied, fighting back with every weapon I have. He gestured toward the phone. That was Jack Morrison, retired lieutenant general. We were in the same cell block at the camp for 7 months. He lost 3 fingers to frostbite and never complained once. After the war, he worked his way up to Deputy Commander of Forces Command before he retired. Elena's eyes widened. You're calling in the old guard. I'm calling in everyone, Thomas said. His trembling hand reached for a notebook on the table beside him. Morrison knows people at the Pentagon. Senator Williams, who was a POW with us in '69, sits on the Armed Services Committee. General Patterson, the one who presided over your hearing, his father served with me at Quai San. The connections go back 50 years, Elena. 50 years of brotherhood forged in blood and suffering. He opened the notebook. The pages were filled with names and phone numbers, written in a shaky hand but meticulously organized. Holt thinks he's fighting one old man with Parkinson's. He's wrong. He's fighting a generation. Over the next 48 hours, Fort Liberty experienced something unprecedented. They arrived in ones and twos at first. Old men in civilian clothes, walking with canes or riding in wheelchairs, their faces weathered by decades, but their eyes still sharp with the fire that had kept them alive through impossible circumstances. Retired General Jack Morrison was the first, 73 years old, silver-haired, with 3 fingers missing from his left hand and a purple heart that he wore on his lapel. He walked into Elena's office without knocking and embraced Thomas like a brother returned from the dead. "You look like hell, Tom." Thomas laughed, his first real laugh in days. "You should see the other guy." Behind Morrison came others. Colonel Frank Davis, who had spent 11 months in solitary confinement and emerged with his sanity intact through sheer force of will. Master Sergeant Paul Williams, no relation to the senator, who had organized escape attempts and suffered the consequences each time. Captain Robert Chen, who had lost both legs below the knee to gangrene but learned to walk again on prosthetics through determination that doctors called impossible. They were men in their 70s and 80s now. Their hair was white or gone entirely. Their bodies bore the marks of age and old wounds. But when they gathered together, something transformed. The years fell away. The tremors and the limps and the missing pieces became invisible. What remained was the essence of what they had always been: warriors. The current soldiers at Fort Liberty watched in awe as these legends walked among them. Word spread through the barracks and the training facilities and the mess halls. The old guard had arrived. The men who had built the modern army were here to defend one of their own. Holt heard about it too. He sat in his office, door closed, blinds drawn, watching through the window as another elderly veteran was helped out of a car by a young sergeant who looked starstruck. The old man wore a Medal of Honor around his neck. Holt's aide knocked on the door. "Sir, Colonel Patterson would like to see you." The meeting was brief. Patterson sat behind his desk with his hands folded, his face carefully neutral. "Lieutenant Colonel Holt, the review board has completed its analysis. Based on testimony from multiple witnesses and a thorough examination of the evidence, we have determined that Master Sergeant Mercer's medical condition does not impair her ability to perform her duties. The hearing is closed. Charges are dismissed." Holt's face reddened. "Colonel, with all due respect, the regulations clearly state—" "The regulations," Patterson interrupted, "are designed to protect soldiers, not to be used as weapons in personal vendettas." He leaned forward. "I've also received some interesting information about maintenance budgets in your area of responsibility, specifically about funds that were diverted from safety systems to other programs that you personally advocated for." Holt went pale. "There will be an investigation," Patterson continued. "Until it's complete, you are relieved of duty. You will surrender your credentials and report to base housing. You are not to have contact with any personnel involved in this matter." He stood, dismissed. The news reached Elena within the hour. She was in the training facility, preparing for the afternoon combatives session, when Webb found her. "It's over," he said. "Holt's been relieved. There's going to be an investigation into his budget practices." Elena nodded slowly. She should have felt relief, should have felt vindication. But all she felt was tired, the kind of bone-deep weariness that came from fighting battles that should never have been necessary in the first place. "Where's my father?" Webb hesitated. "He's in the day room with the others. They've been talking for hours, telling stories, catching up." He paused. "Elena, some of those men haven't seen each other in 40 years. The way they look at Thomas, it's like they're looking at a piece of themselves they thought was lost forever." Elena understood. She had seen it in her own soldiers. The bonds forged in combat never truly broke. They stretched across decades and continents, across careers and retirements, and all the changes that time brought. But they never broke. She found them in this day room, a dozen old men arranged in a loose circle of chairs and wheelchairs. Thomas sat in the center, his trembling hands holding a cup of coffee that someone had thoughtfully fitted with a lid to prevent spilling. The room fell quiet when she entered. Thomas looked up at his daughter with eyes that held more life than she had seen in months. "Elena," he said, "come, sit. There are people here you should meet." She pulled up a chair beside him. The old men studied her with the frank assessment of soldiers evaluating a fellow warrior. She met their gazes without flinching. "This is Jack Morrison," Thomas said, gesturing to the silver-haired general. "We shared a cell for 7 months. He taught me to play chess using pieces we carved from splinters of wood." Morrison smiled. "Your father taught me to pray, not because I believed, but because the routine gave us something to hold on to when everything else was gone." Thomas continued around the circle. Each introduction came with a story, a shared memory, a moment of suffering or courage or dark humor that had helped them survive the unsurvivable. Elena listened. She had heard some of these stories before, fragments that Thomas had shared over the years. But hearing them here, surrounded by the men who had lived them, was different. The stories became real in a way that secondhand telling could never capture. When the introductions were complete, Morrison leaned forward. Your father tells us you've been carrying a piece of shrapnel near your spine for 5 years, that you've been hiding the pain to protect your career. Elena glanced at Thomas, who nodded slightly. Yes, sir, she said. Morrison nodded slowly. In the camp, I watched men endure things that would break most people. Torture, starvation, isolation that lasted months. And you know what separated the ones who survived from the ones who didn't? Elena waited. It wasn't physical strength. Some of the strongest bodies broke first. It wasn't intelligence either. Smart men found too many reasons to give up. He tapped his temple. It was this: the decision to keep going, the choice to find meaning in suffering rather than surrendering to it. He looked at her with eyes that had seen the worst of humanity and somehow still held warmth. You've been making that choice every day for 5 years. Every time you pushed through the pain to teach your soldiers. Every time you hid your weakness to protect your mission. That's not failure, Master Sergeant. That's courage. Elena felt something loosen in her chest. Something that had been clenched tight for longer than she could remember. Thank you, sir. Morrison waved off the formality. We're all soldiers here. Some of us just have more gray hair than others. The day room filled with quiet laughter. For a moment, the weight of decades seemed to lift. These men who had suffered so much, who had lost so much, who carried scars both visible and hidden, found something precious in this gathering. Connection, recognition, the simple comfort of being with others who understood without needing explanation. Thomas reached out and took Elena's hand. His grip trembled but was warm. This is what it means to be a Beckett, he said quietly. Not the medals or the legends or the stories people tell. This, the bonds we forge, the people we protect, the family we choose. Elena squeezed his hand in return. Across the base, Ryan Beckett was facing his own test. He had asked Elena for a chance to prove himself, asked to earn back the respect he had lost in the armory, asked to become something more than the arrogant young man who had tried to grab a weapon from a woman who could destroy him in less than 2 seconds. Elena had agreed, but she had set a condition. The Beckett test. It was a trial that Thomas had designed decades ago, based on the techniques that had helped him survive 14 months of captivity. Physical exhaustion combined with psychological pressure, designed not to break the body, but to strip away the ego and reveal the person underneath. 72 hours, no sleep, minimal food, constant physical and mental challenges. Instructors rotating in shifts to maintain the pressure while Ryan faced it alone. He was now at hour 47. The training yard was dark, 2 in the morning. The summer heat had faded to something almost bearable, but Ryan's body had long since stopped registering temperature. His arms burned from the countless push-ups. His legs ached from the miles of running. His mind floated in the strange space between consciousness and hallucination that comes with extended sleep deprivation. Sergeant Webb stood over him, flashlight in hand. On your feet, Private. Ryan pushed himself up from the ground. His movements were mechanical now. The part of his brain that complained and resisted had gone quiet around hour 30. What remained was something simpler, more fundamental. Do the next thing, then the next, then the next. Tell me about your father, Webb said. Ryan blinked. The question caught him off guard. For the first 2 days, the instructors had asked only tactical questions. Strategic problems, physical demands. This was different. My father, he repeated. His voice was hoarse from dehydration. Your father. Webb's tone was neutral. Daniel Beckett, tell me about him. Ryan's exhausted mind struggled to form thoughts into words. He was a ranger, a captain. He served in Mogadishu. That's his service record. I asked about your father, the man. Who was he? Ryan tried to remember, tried to summon the stories he had been told, the images he had constructed over 22 years. But they felt hollow now, empty shells where a real person should have been. I don't know, he admitted finally. I never really knew him. I just knew what people told me about him. Webb nodded slowly. And what did they tell you? That he was a hero, that he died fighting, that he was everything a Beckett should be. Webb was quiet for a moment. Then he asked the question that Ryan had been avoiding since he read his father's letter. And now that you know the truth, now that you know he struggled, that he made mistakes, that he couldn't carry his burdens alone, who is he now? Ryan felt something break inside him. Not the sharp break of bone or the sudden snap of a rope, a slower break. The crumbling of a wall that had been built over 2 decades. He was human, Ryan said. His voice cracked on the word. He was just a human being who tried his best and failed sometimes. Who carried guilt that he couldn't put down. Who loved his family but couldn't figure out how to ask for help. Tears streamed down his face. He couldn't remember the last time he had cried. Maybe never. Beckett's didn't cry. That was what he had always believed. He was my father, Ryan continued, and I never got to know him. Not really. I just knew the story, the legend. And now the legend is gone, and all I have left is questions I can never ask. Webb reached out and put a hand on Ryan's shoulder. That's the truth, he said quietly. That's what the test is designed to find, not your physical limits. Those don't matter. What matters is whether you can face the truth about yourself and the people you come from. Whether you can strip away the myths and still find something worth believing in. He released Ryan's shoulder. Your father was flawed. He made mistakes. He broke under pressure that would have broken most men. But he also loved you enough to want to protect you from his own pain. He asked Elena to build a myth because he wanted you to have a hero, even if he couldn't be that hero himself. Webb stepped back. The question now is what you do with that knowledge. Do you use it to destroy yourself the way Daniel did? Do you carry it alone until it crushes you? Or do you learn from it? Do you become something different? Something better? Ryan wiped his face with a trembling hand. I don't know if I can be better, he said. I don't know if I have it in me. Webb almost smiled. That's the first honest thing you've said in 47 hours. The alarm shattered the night like glass breaking. Ryan heard it first as a distant wail, his exhausted brain slow to process the sound. Then Webb's posture changed. His body went rigid. His head snapped toward the training complex a quarter-mile away. That's the emergency signal, Webb said. His voice had shifted from instructor to soldier in an instant. Stay here. He was running before Ryan could respond. Ryan stood alone in the darkness, swaying slightly, watching Webb's flashlight bob and weave toward the distant buildings. The alarm continued to wail. Red lights began to flash on the complex roof. Something was wrong. Something was very wrong. He should stay. Webb had ordered him to stay. The test required him to follow orders without question. But somewhere in the fog of his exhaustion, a different voice spoke. Thomas's voice. Elena's voice. Kevin Chen's voice from a letter written before Ryan was born. Real soldiers don't leave their people behind. Ryan started running. His legs screamed. His lungs burned. 47 hours without sleep had reduced his body to something barely functional. But he ran anyway, because somewhere in that complex people might need help. And Ryan Beckett was done standing on the sidelines while others fought. The scene at the CQB training facility was chaos. Smoke poured from the ventilation system. Soldiers in emergency gear crowded around the entrance. Someone was shouting about a malfunction, about filters that had failed, about smoke grenades used in training exercises that had released toxic fumes instead of dissipating safely. 4 trainees trapped inside. Ryan pushed through the crowd. His fatigue was forgotten now, replaced by the clarity that comes with crisis. He spotted Elena near the entrance, arguing with a sergeant who was trying to hold her back. The air filtration system failed, the sergeant was saying. The whole building is full of smoke. We can't send anyone in until we get respirators from the fire station. Elena's voice was sharp. How long? 10 minutes, maybe 15. They don't have 15 minutes. She pulled free from the sergeant's grip and moved toward the door. Ryan reached her just as she was about to enter. Let me help. Elena looked at him, took in his exhausted face, his trembling hands, his eyes that burned with determination despite 47 hours without rest. You should be in the training yard. Ryan shook his head. You said being a Beckett means protecting people. Let me prove it. For a moment, Elena studied him. Then she nodded once. Stay close. Move low. The smoke will be thinner near the floor. If I tell you to get out, you get out. No arguments. Yes, ma'am. They entered the building together. The smoke was thick and acrid, clawing at Ryan's throat with every breath. Elena moved through it like a ghost, her body low, her movements efficient. Ryan followed as best he could, using her silhouette as a guide through the murk. The training facility was a maze of rooms and corridors designed to simulate urban combat environments. walls and doorways and obstacles that were disorienting even in clear conditions. In the smoke, they were nearly impossible. Elena called out, "Chen, Rodriguez, Williams, Carter, sound off." A voice came from somewhere to their left. Weak, coughing. "Here, we're here." They found them in one of the shoot-house rooms. 4 young soldiers huddled against the far wall, sharing the small amount of clean air that remained near the floor. Private First Class Sarah Chen was among them, her face pale but her eyes alert. "Can you move?" Elena asked. Sarah nodded. "Williams is hurt. Fell when the smoke started. Might be a broken ankle." Elena assessed the situation in seconds. "Ryan, help Williams. I'll take point. Chen, you and the others follow close behind. We go out the same way we came in." Ryan moved to Private Williams, a young man maybe 20 years old, and helped him to his feet. Williams winced but didn't cry out. He wrapped an arm around Ryan's shoulders and prepared to move. They started toward the exit. The smoke was thicker now. The failed ventilation system had turned the building into a death trap, concentrating the fumes instead of dispersing them. Ryan's eyes watered, his lungs ached. Every breath felt like inhaling fire. But he kept moving, one step, then another, supporting Williams' weight even as his own legs threatened to give out. They were almost at the exit when they heard the crack. Ryan looked up just in time to see a section of the ceiling begin to collapse. Damaged by the heat, weakened by age and the kind of deferred maintenance that happened when budgets were cut, the support beam had finally given way. It was falling directly toward Elena. Ryan didn't think, didn't calculate, didn't weigh options or consider consequences. He simply moved. He shoved Williams towards Sarah and the others. Then he threw himself forward, reaching for Elena, trying to push her clear of the falling debris. He was too slow, but someone else wasn't. Thomas Beckett came out of nowhere. Ryan didn't know how his grandfather had gotten into the building. Didn't know how a 71-year-old man with Parkinson's had moved fast enough to reach them. Later, he would learn that Thomas had been in the day room when the alarm sounded, that he had ignored every protest and every physical limitation to enter the building through a side door, that some things were stronger than trembling hands and aging bodies. What Ryan saw was this: his grandfather's body slamming into Elena, driving her sideways, out of the path of the falling beam. The beam striking Thomas instead. The sound of impact, metal on flesh, the crunch of bone breaking. Thomas going down. No, Ryan's scream tore through the smoke. He was at his grandfather's side in seconds, dropping to his knees beside the fallen man. The beam had struck Thomas's shoulder and head, driving him to the ground with force that would have killed a younger man. Thomas was conscious, barely. His eyes were open, unfocused, trying to find something to hold on to in the chaos. Elena was there beside Ryan, blood on her forehead from a glancing blow, her hands moving over Thomas's body, checking for injuries. "Papa, Papa, stay with me. Don't you dare leave me now." Thomas's trembling hand found Elena's. His grip was weak, weaker than it had ever been. Did I get you clear?" "Yes, Papa. You got me clear. You saved me." A ghost of a smile crossed Thomas's face. "Good," he whispered. "That's good." His eyes found Ryan's face. "You came back," he said. His voice was barely audible. "You didn't stay where they told you. You came back." Ryan's tears fell freely. "I couldn't leave them. Couldn't leave you." Thomas nodded slightly. The movement cost him. Pain flickered across his features. "That's what being a Beckett means," he said. "Not the name, not the blood. The choice to stand with your people when it matters." His trembling hand released Elena's and reached toward Ryan. "I've made so many mistakes," he said. "Raised Daniel wrong. Raised Elena to hide her pain. Let secrets fester until they poisoned everything." He gripped Ryan's hand with what strength he had left. "Don't make my mistakes. Don't carry your burdens alone. Don't let pride destroy you the way it almost destroyed your father." His eyes began to close. "You're the future, Ryan. You and Elena both. I've done what I can. The rest is up to you." "Papa!" Elena's voice was desperate. "Stay awake. The medics are coming. Stay with us." Thomas's grip on Ryan's hand tightened for a moment, then relaxed. "I'm tired," he whispered. "So tired." His eyes closed. "No, no, no, no." Elena's hands moved to his neck, checking for a pulse. She found one, weak but present. "He's alive," she said. "He's alive, but we have to move him now." Ryan didn't hesitate. He positioned himself at Thomas's feet while Elena took his shoulders. Together, they lifted the old soldier and began to move toward the exit. Sarah and the others had already escaped. The way was clear. They emerged into the night air to find chaos. Fire trucks had arrived. Emergency lights painted everything in shades of red and blue. Medics rushed forward with a stretcher. Hands reached out to take Thomas from their grip. Ryan stood back and watched them load his grandfather into the ambulance. Elena climbed in beside him, refusing to leave. The doors closed. The vehicle pulled away, sirens wailing. For a long moment, Ryan stood alone in the flashing lights, covered in soot and sweat and his grandfather's blood. Soldiers moved around him. Orders were shouted. The crisis response continued. But Ryan was somewhere else. He was in a prison cell 50 years ago, watching a young man learn to survive the unsurvivable. He was in a bunker in Afghanistan, watching a woman fight her way back to save a dying friend. He was in an office at Fort Benning, watching a broken man make a final, terrible choice. He was everywhere and nowhere, seeing his family's history laid out before him like a map of wounds and courage and terrible mistakes. And he understood, finally, what it meant to be a Beckett. Not the myths, not the legends, not the stories told in museums and barracks rooms. Being a Beckett meant showing up when it mattered, making the choice to stand with your people, even when standing was the hardest thing in the world. Carrying your wounds openly so that others would know they weren't alone in their pain. Being a Beckett meant being human, flawed and afraid and sometimes broken, but never alone. Webb found him standing there, staring at the spot where the ambulance had been. "The hospital," Ryan said. His voice was steady now. Clear. The voice of a man who knew exactly what he needed to do. "I need to get to the hospital." Webb nodded. "I'll drive." They rode in silence through the darkness. The base slipped past outside the windows, familiar buildings transformed by the late hour into shadowy monuments. Ryan watched the lights pass and thought about time. How it moved forward relentlessly, carrying everyone along whether they were ready or not. How it buried the past even as it created the future. How it gave second chances to those willing to take them. Thomas had given him a second chance, had literally put his body between Elena and destruction, had shown through action what it meant to sacrifice for the people you loved. Now it was Ryan's turn to learn from that example. The hospital was bright and sterile and filled with the quiet urgency of medical professionals doing their work. Ryan found Elena in the waiting room outside the trauma unit. She sat alone, still wearing her smoke-stained uniform, her hands clasped in her lap. He sat down beside her. For a long moment, neither of them spoke. Then Elena broke the silence. "He has a fractured clavicle and a moderate concussion. Some internal bruising. The doctors say he'll survive, but recovery will be difficult. The Parkinson's complicates everything." She turned to look at Ryan. He shouldn't have been anywhere near that building. A man his age with his condition, he could barely walk across the day room without help. But somehow he got into that building. Somehow he reached us in time. She shook her head slowly. "That's your grandfather, Ryan. That's who Thomas Beckett really is. Not the Medal of Honor or the war stories or the legend. Just a man who refuses to stop fighting for the people he loves." Ryan felt his throat tighten. "I'm sorry," he said, "for everything, for the armory, for reading your letter without permission, for every arrogant, stupid thing I've done since I got here." Elena studied his face for a long moment. "You ran into that building tonight," she said. "You were 47 hours into the hardest test of your life, and when you heard the alarm, you ran toward the danger instead of away from it. You helped carry Thomas out even though your body was ready to collapse." She reached out and put her hand on his shoulder. "That's not the same young man who tried to grab my rifle 2 weeks ago." Ryan met her eyes. "I want to be better. I want to learn how to be the kind of person Grandpa is, the kind of person you are." Elena was quiet for a moment. When she spoke, her voice was softer than he had ever heard it. "I can't teach you to be like Thomas. No one can teach that. What he has, what he's always had, comes from somewhere inside that no training can reach." She squeezed his shoulder. "But I can teach you to be yourself, the best version of yourself, the version that ran into a burning building to help people, the version that admitted he was wrong and asked for a second chance." She almost smiled. "That's the version worth fighting for." The doctor emerged from the trauma unit. A woman in her 50s, tired but professional, with the kind of calm competence that came from decades of dealing with emergencies. "Family of Thomas Beckett?" Elena stood. "How is he?" "Stable. The fracture is clean and should heal well with proper care. The concussion is our main concern. At his age, with his existing neurological condition, we want to keep him under observation for at least 48 hours. She paused. "He's awake, asking for both of you." They found Thomas in a private room, propped up against pillows, his left arm immobilized in a sling. Medical monitors beeped quietly in the background. The fluorescent lights were dimmed, casting soft shadows across his weathered face. His eyes were open, clear, tired but present. Elena went to him first. She took his uninjured hand and held it between both of hers. "You stupid, brave, wonderful old man," she said. "What were you thinking?" Thomas's voice was weak, but carried a hint of his usual dry humor. "I was thinking that I'm 71 years old and I've already lived longer than I expected. Seemed like a fair trade." "It wasn't your trade to make." Thomas's eyes found Ryan, standing at the foot of the bed. "Come here, son." Ryan moved to stand beside Elena. Up close, his grandfather looked smaller than he remembered. Frailer, the invincible warrior of family legend reduced to an old man in a hospital bed. But his eyes were still the same, still held that impossible fire that had kept him alive through everything. "I saw you," Thomas said, "in the building helping the others, running toward danger when any sane person would have run away." He reached out with his trembling hand. Ryan took it. "That's the Beckett legacy," Thomas said. "Not medals or myths or stories. The willingness to sacrifice. The choice to put others before yourself. The courage to keep going even when everything tells you to stop." His grip tightened on Ryan's hand. "I spent too many years teaching Daniel and Elena the wrong lessons. Teaching them that strength meant hiding pain. That being a Beckett meant being invincible. That asking for help was weakness." His voice cracked. "I was wrong, and my son died because of it." He looked at Ryan with eyes full of grief and hope, and something that might have been redemption. "Don't make my mistakes. Don't be the legend. Be the person behind it. Be someone who admits when they're struggling, who asks for help when they need it, who lets others carry part of the weight." He glanced at Elena. "That's what I finally learned. Too late. What she's been trying to teach me for years. What the men who came to defend her this week have been showing me by example." He turned back to Ryan. "We're stronger together than we are alone. That's the truth that took me 71 years to understand. Don't wait that long to learn it yourself." Ryan felt tears on his face again. For the second time that night, the second time he could remember. "I won't," he said. "I promise." Thomas nodded. His eyes were growing heavy, the medication and the exhaustion pulling him towards sleep. "One more thing," he whispered. Ryan leaned closer. "The investigation into Holt. They found something. Budget irregularities. Safety systems that were defunded to pay for his pet projects." Thomas's eyes closed. "The ventilation system that failed tonight. The one that almost killed those soldiers. It was supposed to be replaced 6 months ago. Holt redirected the funds." His voice faded to barely a whisper. "He didn't just try to destroy Elena's career. He created the conditions that almost killed her. Almost killed all of you." Then Thomas was asleep. Elena and Ryan stood in silence, watching the old man breathe. The monitors beeped their steady rhythm. Outside the window, dawn was beginning to lighten the eastern sky. Finally, Elena spoke. "Holt will face charges now. Dereliction of duty at minimum, possibly criminal negligence. His career is finished." She looked at Ryan. "But that doesn't matter right now. What matters is that Thomas is alive, that those trainees are alive, that we survived another crisis that could have destroyed everything." She moved toward the door. "Get some rest, Ryan. You've been awake for almost 50 hours. The human body has limits." Ryan didn't move. He stood at his grandfather's bedside, watching the old man sleep. Elena paused at the door. "What is it?" Ryan's voice was quiet. "Can you teach me? Not just combatives, everything. How to be the kind of soldier that people trust. How to lead without letting the pressure destroy me. How to carry the weight without breaking." He turned to face her. "I know I don't deserve it. I know I haven't earned it. But I want to try. I want to be better. For Grandpa, for my father, for myself." Elena studied him for a long moment. The dawn light was beginning to filter through the window, painting the room in shades of gold. When she spoke, her voice held something new. Warmth. Hope. The beginning of something that might eventually become trust. "I can't teach you to be someone else," she said. "I can't give you Thomas's fire or your father's courage or any of the things that made the Becketts legendary." She walked back to stand beside him. "But I can teach you to be yourself. The version of yourself that ran into a burning building tonight. The version that admitted he was wrong. The version that asked for help instead of pretending he didn't need it." She put her hand on his shoulder. "That's enough. That's more than enough. That's the foundation that everything else gets built on." Ryan met her eyes. His aunt. His teacher. The woman who had carried impossible burdens for longer than he had been alive. "When do we start?" Elena almost smiled. That rare expression that transformed her face from the ghost into something more human. You already have. She released his shoulder and moved toward the door. Now get some rest. Tomorrow we have work to do. She paused at the threshold and looked back one more time. Welcome to the family, Ryan. The real one, not the legend, not the myth, just broken people trying to be better. Together. Then she was gone. Ryan pulled up a chair beside his grandfather's bed and sat down. His body ached with exhaustion. His mind swam with everything that had happened. The test, the fire, Thomas's sacrifice, the revelations about Holt. But beneath the exhaustion, beneath the pain, something else burned. Purpose. He had spent 22 years chasing a ghost, trying to live up to a legend that never existed, measuring himself against myths instead of truths. That was over now. Tomorrow he would begin again, not as Thomas Beckett's grandson or Daniel Beckett's son, as himself, Ryan Beckett, a man with a family history full of wounds and failures and terrible mistakes, and a future that was finally his own to write. The sun rose over Fort Liberty. Golden light spilled through the hospital window. Thomas slept on, his breathing steady, his trembling hands finally still. Ryan watched over him through the morning hours, standing guard the way generations of soldiers had stood guard before him, waiting for whatever came next, ready for whatever came next. For the first time in his life, that was enough. 6 months changed everything. The autumn leaves had fallen and been swept away. Winter had come and gone, leaving Fort Liberty dusted with the occasional snow that melted by noon. Spring arrived with dogwood blossoms and longer days. And through it all, the Beckett family healed. Thomas Beckett moved out of the Virginia Veterans Care Center and into a small house just outside the base, a house that Ryan had rented with his own savings. The old soldier could no longer live alone. The Parkinson's had progressed during his recovery from the accident, stealing more of his body's control with each passing month. But his mind remained sharp and his spirit remained unbroken. Every morning, grandfather and grandson sat together on the small back porch, watching the sun rise over the Carolina pines. Thomas in his wheelchair now, a concession to reality that he had fought against for months before finally accepting. Ryan in a wooden chair beside him, often still in his PT clothes after an early run. They talked during those mornings, really talked, in ways they never had before. Thomas shared stories he had never told anyone. Stories from the pump that went beyond the official accounts. Stories about fear and doubt in the moments when giving up seemed like the only option. Stories about the men who did not make it and why their memories deserved to be carried forward. Ryan listened, asked questions, learned that heroism was not the absence of fear, but the decision to act despite it. Learned that the legendary Thomas Beckett had been terrified every single day of his captivity, and that acknowledging that terror was not weakness, but honesty. They talked about Daniel too, about the son Thomas had raised wrong, loved deeply, and lost to wounds that no one could see. About the mistakes that had been made and the lessons that came too late. About the importance of breaking the cycle, of raising the next generation differently. Ryan learned more about his father in those 6 months than he had in 32 years of mythology. He learned that Daniel had been funny, with a dry wit that could make an entire room laugh. He learned that Daniel had been kind, the sort of man who remembered birthdays and sent handwritten notes. He learned that Daniel had been struggling, visibly struggling, for years before Mogadishu, and that everyone who loved him had been too caught up in the Beckett legend to see it. The truth hurt, but it also healed, because the truth made Daniel human, and humans could be mourned in ways that legends could not. Elena visited every weekend. She would arrive Friday evening and stay until Sunday, sleeping in the small guest room that Ryan had set up for her. The three of them would cook dinner together, Thomas directing from his wheelchair, while Elena and Ryan did the actual work. They ate as a family, laughed as a family, grieved as a family. For the first time in decades, they were actually a family instead of three people orbiting the same collection of myths and secrets. Elena's career had not only survived the Holt incident, but flourished in its aftermath. The investigation into budget irregularities had expanded to reveal a pattern of negligence across multiple facilities. Holt was court-martialed and dishonorably discharged. 2 other officers who had enabled his schemes faced administrative action. And Elena was promoted. Sergeant Major Elena Mercer, the highest enlisted rank in the United States Army. She received her new stripes in a ceremony attended by hundreds of soldiers, including a dozen aging veterans who had flown in from across the country to watch Thomas Beckett's adopted daughter reach the pinnacle of enlisted service. Thomas watched from his wheelchair, tears streaming down his weathered face. His trembling hands tried to applaud but could only manage a weak approximation. It did not matter. His eyes said everything his body could not. That same month, Elena made another decision that she had been postponing for 5 years: the surgery to remove the shrapnel from her spine. The risks had not changed. Still a significant chance of complications, still the possibility of permanent damage. But Elena had changed. The woman who had carried that metal fragment as a reminder of Korengal, as a physical manifestation of the guilt she could not release, had finally learned that she did not need the pain to remember. The memories would stay with her regardless. The sacrifices of the men she lost would never be forgotten, whether she suffered daily or not. The operation took 4 hours. Ryan and Thomas waited in the hospital together, the old man's trembling hand gripping his grandson's steady one. When the surgeon emerged and announced that the procedure had been successful, that the fragment had been removed without complication, Thomas closed his eyes and whispered something that might have been a prayer. Elena woke the next morning to find both of them asleep in chairs beside her bed. Thomas's head was tilted back, his mouth slightly open, looking peaceful in a way she rarely saw him. Ryan was slumped forward, his hand still holding hers. She lay there for a light moment, feeling the absence of pain that had been her constant companion for half a decade. The ache was gone. The grinding pressure against her nerves had vanished. She could breathe without the familiar catch of discomfort, and she realized that she was crying. Not from pain, not from grief, from relief. From the release of a burden she had carried so long that she had forgotten what it felt like to stand without it. Thomas stirred. His eyes opened and found hers. "How do you feel?" he asked, his voice rough with sleep and tremors. Elena smiled through her tears. "Light," she said. "I feel light." Ryan completed Ranger School 3 months after Elena's surgery. He had earned his place the hard way. No favoritism, no special treatment, no one caring that he was Thomas Beckett's grandson or Elena Mercer's nephew. He went through the same brutal training as every other candidate, starved alongside them, froze alongside them, pushed beyond every limit he thought he had alongside them. And when the weak link moments came, when his body screamed for him to quit and his mind offered 1,000 reasons to give up, he thought about the lessons he had learned. About Daniel, who had carried his burdens alone until they crushed him. About Elena, who had finally allowed others to share her weight. About Thomas, who had survived the unsurvivable by choosing to keep going one moment at a time. He graduated with honors, top 15% of his class. The ceremony was held at Fort Benning, on a parade field that had witnessed generations of Rangers receive their tabs. The Georgia sun beat down mercilessly. Families crowded the bleachers, waving small flags and holding cameras. Thomas was there in his wheelchair, wearing his dress uniform for the first time in years. It hung loose on his diminished frame, but the metal still gleamed. Elena stood beside him in her own dress uniform, the diamond of a sergeant major glinting on her collar. When Ryan's name was called, when he marched forward to receive the tan beret that marked him as a Ranger, he looked toward the bleachers and found his grandfather's eyes. Thomas raised his trembling hand in a salute. Ryan returned it. Across the distance, across the years, across all the pain and secrets and terrible mistakes, something passed between them, an acknowledgement, a blessing, a torch handed from one generation to the next. Sarah Chen graduated from Officer Candidate School 1 month after Ryan received his Ranger tab. She had applied on Elena's recommendation with a letter of support that detailed her exceptional performance in the combatives program and her demonstrated leadership potential. The admissions board had been impressed not just by her skills, but by her story. The daughter of a fallen soldier, following in her father's footsteps, mentored by the woman who had held her father's hand as he died. Second Lieutenant Sarah Chen, the first officer in her family. Her mother flew in from California for the commissioning ceremony, a woman in her 50s with Kevin Chen's eyes and a smile that spoke of pride and grief intertwined. Elena administered the oath. Her voice was steady as she spoke the words that had been spoken to generations of new officers. Words about duty and honor and the Constitution of the United States. When it was done, when Sarah's gold bars were pinned to her shoulders, the young woman embraced Elena in front of the entire assembly. Protocol be damned. Some moments transcended regulation. "I wish he could see this," Sarah whispered. "My father. I wish he could see what his sacrifice made possible." Elena held her tight. He sees, she said. Wherever he is, whatever comes after this life, he sees, and he is so proud of you. The memorial ceremony was held on a Saturday in late spring. Elena had organized it herself, a gathering to honor the fallen of Korengal, specifically the men who had died in the August 2019 attack. Their names had never been widely publicized. Their sacrifices had been classified, redacted, reduced to numbers in reports that few people would ever read. Elena believed they deserved more. The ceremony took place at Fort Liberty, in a small memorial garden near the combatives training facility. A stone marker had been erected, carved with the names of the 4 Americans who died that night. Kevin Chen's name was at the top. Sarah stood beside the marker, one hand resting on the granite where her father's name was engraved. Her dress uniform was perfect. Her composure was absolute, but her eyes were wet. Elena spoke first. She told the story of that night, the unclassified version, stripped of tactical details but rich with the humanity of the men who had fought and died. She spoke of Kevin's calm in the chaos, of his decision to stay behind, of his final words about his daughter. Then she did something she had never done publicly before. She read Kevin's letter. Not Daniel's letter, Kevin's letter. The one he had written to his wife the day before the attack. The one Sarah had shown her 6 months ago. The one that spoke of duty and sacrifice and the love a father holds for his daughter. Her voice broke twice during the reading. She did not hide it, did not apologize for it. Let the grief flow openly, sharing the weight with everyone present. When she finished, she looked at Sarah. Your father was the bravest man I ever served with. Not because he was not afraid. He was terrified that night, we all were, but he chose to act anyway. He chose to give others a chance to live, even knowing what it would cost him. She touched the stone marker. That is what courage really means, not the absence of fear. The decision to do what is right despite it. Sarah stepped forward and placed a small photograph at the base of the marker. Kevin Chen, in civilian clothes, holding a baby girl, smiling at the camera with the pure joy of new fatherhood. 20 years ago, Sarah said, that is me in his arms. He used to carry that photo everywhere. Mom said it was in his pocket when they brought his things home. She straightened and saluted the marker. Rest easy, Dad. I have got it from here. After the ceremony, Thomas gave Elena a gift. They were alone in her office, the door closed against the noise of the base outside. Thomas sat in his wheelchair, a small wooden box resting on his lap. His hands trembled as he lifted the lid. Inside, resting on faded velvet, was a pair of handcuffs. They were old, rusted in places. The metal was scratched and dented from decades of handling, but they had been carefully preserved, cleaned regularly, treated with the reverence of sacred objects. Elena recognized them immediately. She had seen them before long ago in a display of mice in Thomas's study. She had never asked about them. These are the shackles they put on me, Thomas said. His voice was quieter than usual, even accounting for the tremors. The first night in the camp, they chained all of us to the walls, left us there for 3 days before the first interrogation. He lifted the handcuffs with hands that shook so badly the metal clinked against itself. I kept them when I came home, smuggled them out in my clothes. The guards never searched us when they released us. Too eager to be rid of us, I think. He held them out toward Elena. For decades, I have kept these as a reminder that chains do not define us, that what our captors do to our bodies does not determine what we become, that the only prison that truly holds us is the one we build in our own minds. Elena took the handcuffs. They were heavier than she expected, cold despite the warmth of the room. Thomas's eyes met hers. I am giving them to you now because you have finally broken free of your own chains. The guilt you carried for Korengal, the pain you used as penance, the belief that you had to suffer alone. His trembling hand covered hers. You are free now, Elena, free to live without the weight, free to teach others how to find their own freedom. That is the legacy worth passing on. Not medals or myths, freedom. Elena looked at the handcuffs in her hands. Decades of history, decades of survival and struggle and refusing to break. And now they were hers. She understood the gift, understood what Thomas was really saying. He was passing the torch, acknowledging that his time was coming to an end and that the lessons he had learned through suffering needed to be carried forward. I will keep them safe, she said, and I will remember what they mean. Thomas smiled. His trembling intensified, a sign that the day had exhausted him. I know you will. That is why I chose you. All those years ago when I drove to Tennessee to bring home a broken little girl, I saw something in your eyes. something that told me you would survive, that you would not just survive, but become someone extraordinary. His voice faded to a whisper. I was right. 1 year after the fire at Fort Liberty, the Beckett family traveled to Washington, D.C. Thomas had been invited to speak at the annual National POW Recognition Day ceremony at Arlington National Cemetery, a gathering of former prisoners of war and their families, held each year to honor those who had endured captivity and those who had not returned. The invitation had come from the Secretary of Veterans Affairs himself, a man who remembered Thomas from a chance meeting decades ago and had never forgotten the impression he made. Thomas almost refused. His Parkinson's had progressed significantly over the past year. He could no longer walk unassisted. His speech was sometimes slurred. His tremors had become so severe that eating required a specialized spoon to prevent spilling. But Elena convinced him. This might be his last chance to speak publicly, his last chance to share the lessons of a lifetime with an audience that needed to hear them, his last chance to stand before the assembled veterans and honor the friends who never made it home. So they went. The morning of the ceremony was overcast, the sky heavy with clouds that threatened rain but never delivered. Arlington National Cemetery stretched out before them, row upon row of white headstones marching across the green hills like soldiers standing in eternal formation. The weight of sacrifice hung in the air like incense. Thomas approached in his wheelchair, pushed by Ryan. Elena walked beside them. Behind them came a small procession of aging veterans, men who had served with Thomas, who had been in the camps with him, who had somehow survived to grow old in a country that sometimes remembered their sacrifice and sometimes forgot. The ceremony began with the national anthem, sung by a choir of military children. Then came the speeches. The Secretary of Veterans Affairs, a retired general, a senator who had lost her father during captivity decades ago. Then it was Thomas's turn. Ryan wheeled him to the podium. A microphone had been adjusted to reach him at seated height. The crowd of several hundred fell silent, waiting. Thomas looked out at the faces before him, young and old, veterans and civilians, families who had lost someone, and families who had simply come to pay respect. He looked at the rows of white headstones stretching away in every direction, thousands of names, thousands of stories that had ended in service to their country. And then, with visible effort, Command Sergeant Major Thomas Beckett did something impossible. He stood up. Ryan moved to support him on one side. Elena took the other. Together, together they held him upright, bearing his weight so that he could face the crowd as the soldier he had always been. His voice shook. His body trembled, but his words were clear. Decades ago, I was a prisoner, 23 years old, certain that I would die in a cell far from home. He paused, gathering strength. A man saved my life in that camp. An older prisoner, Colonel Harrison. He had been there longer than any of us, had suffered more than any of us, but he never lost hope, never stopped believing that we would make it home. The crowd was utterly silent. He taught me something that I have carried every day since. He said that legacy is not what we achieve. It is what we pass on, the lessons we teach, the values we instill, the hope we give to those who come after us. Thomas's eyes found Elena in the crowd beside him. Colonel Harrison died 2 weeks before freedom came, 2 weeks before release. He never made it home. But his legacy survived. In me, in the hundreds of prisoners he helped keep alive through the darkest nights. He turned his gaze to Ryan. I have made many mistakes in my life. I raised my son to believe that strength meant suffering in silence. I let him die rather than ask if he was okay. I taught my adopted daughter to hide her pain behind a mask of invincibility. His voice cracked. Those mistakes cost me more than I can ever express. My son is gone. Years of my daughter's life were consumed by unnecessary pain. My grandson grew up believing in myths instead of truths. He straightened slightly, Ryan and Elena adjusting their grip to support him. But I have also been blessed to live long enough to see my mistakes recognized, blessed to have the chance to teach a different lesson, blessed to watch the next generation learn what took me decades to understand. He looked out at the crowd with eyes that held decades of wisdom earned through suffering. We are not heroes because we never break. We are heroes because we break and keep going. We are heroes because we ask for help when we need it. We are heroes because we share our burdens instead of carrying them alone. His trembling hand gestured toward the headstones. These men and women, these thousands of souls, they did not die so that we could suffer in silence. They died so that we could live. really live, with honesty and connection and the courage to be vulnerable. His voice rose, finding strength from somewhere deep inside. That is the legacy of the American warrior. Not the battles we won or lost, not the medals we earned or the wounds we carry. The legacy is this: we survived, we came home, and we learned that survival means nothing if we cannot help others survive too. He looked at Elena one more time. My daughter taught me that. After everything I taught her wrong, she taught me right. She showed me that strength is not about being invincible. It is about being wounded and continuing anyway. It is about letting others carry part of the weight. His eyes moved to Ryan. My grandson taught me that legacy is not about blood. It is about choice. He chose to run toward danger when everyone else ran away. He chose to admit his mistakes and ask for a second chance. He chose to become something better than the myths he inherited. Thomas's voice dropped to barely a whisper, but the microphone carried every word. I am 72 years old. My body is failing. My time is short. But I am not afraid, because I know that what matters will survive. The lessons will be passed on. The flame will continue to burn. He looked one final time at the headstones, at the names of friends he had outlived by half a century. To my brothers who rest here, I kept the faith. I passed it on. I will see you soon. Then his strength gave out. Ryan and Elena eased him back into the wheelchair. The crowd erupted in applause that lasted nearly 5 minutes. Veterans in the audience stood at attention, saluting. Families wept openly. Even the Secretary of Veterans Affairs wiped tears from his eyes. Thomas sat in his wheelchair, exhausted but peaceful, watching the ovation wash over him like a wave. He had said what needed to be said, done what needed to be done. The rest was up to others now. Elena knelt beside him and took his trembling hand. You did it, Papa. They heard you. Thomas smiled weakly. Not me, he whispered. Us. All of us. Thomas Beckett died 2 years later, on a quiet Tuesday morning in spring. He was 74 years old. The Parkinson's had progressed to the point where he could no longer speak clearly, could no longer feed himself, could no longer do most of the things that had defined his independence. But he had remained lucid until the end, his mind sharp even as his body failed. Ryan was with him when it happened, had been sleeping in the chair beside his bed, as he had done most nights for the past 6 months. He woke to the sound of silence, the absence of his grandfather's labored breathing, and knew immediately what had occurred. He did not cry, not at first. He simply sat there, holding Thomas's still hand, watching the dawn light creep across the floor the way they had watched it together so many mornings on the back porch. Elena arrived within the hour, summoned by Ryan's phone call. She stood in the doorway of the bedroom for a long moment, looking at the man who had saved her life twice. Once when he adopted her, once when he pushed her out of the path of a falling beam. She crossed to the bed and kissed his forehead. Rest easy, Papa. You have earned it. The funeral was held at Arlington National Cemetery with full military honors. A flag-draped coffin, a horse-drawn caisson, a 21-gun salute that echoed across the rows of white headstones like thunder from a distant war. Hundreds attended, veterans from every era, officers who had served under Thomas's command, enlisted soldiers who had been trained by his methods, politicians and generals, and ordinary citizens who had heard his story and been moved by it. Elena delivered the eulogy. She spoke of the man behind the legend, the father who made mistakes and learned from them, the teacher who finally discovered that the best lessons come from admitting what you do not know, the warrior who found peace not in victory but in connection. Ryan stood beside the grave as the casket was lowered. He held the folded flag that had been presented to him as next of kin. Thomas had no other living relatives. His wife had died decades ago. His son was gone. Elena, despite being his adopted daughter, had insisted that Ryan receive the flag. It was what Thomas would have wanted, she said, the symbol of legacy passing to the next generation. When the ceremony ended, when the crowds dispersed, Ryan remained at the graveside. Elena stood with him in silence. Finally, Ryan spoke. He told me something. The last night he could still talk clearly. He said that being a Beckett is not about the name. It is about the choice to show up when it matters, to carry others when they cannot carry themselves, to keep going even when everything tells you to stop. He looked at Elena. I want to honor that. I want to spend my life proving that his lessons were not wasted on me. Elena nodded slowly. What did you have in mind? Ryan's jaw set with determination. Teach me everything, not just combatives, Everything you know about leadership, about surviving trauma, about helping others find their way through the darkness. I want to do what you do. I want to carry the torch forward. Elena studied his face for a long moment. She saw traces of Daniel there, traces of Thomas, but mostly she saw Ryan, a man who had been broken and rebuilt, who had learned from terrible mistakes, who was ready to become something new. Then let us get to work. 5 years after Thomas Beckett's death, Elena Mercer retired from the United States Army. She was 47 years old, 25 years of service, 5 combat deployments, author of the definitive manual on military hand-to-hand combat, mentor to thousands of soldiers who had passed through her training programs. And now she was done. Not done with service, never done with that, but done with the uniform, done with the regulations and the politics and the bureaucracy that came with military life. Ready to serve in a different way. She used her retirement and savings, combined with donations from grateful veterans and the foundation that Thomas's old POW brotherhood had established in his memory, to open a treatment center for veterans suffering from PTSD and traumatic brain injury. She called it the Beckett Foundation. The facility occupied a converted farmhouse on 50 acres outside Fort Liberty. Peaceful grounds, private rooms, a staff of counselors and medical professionals who understood that the wounds of war went deeper than flesh and bone. Elena ran the programs herself, taught combatives as therapy, helping veterans rediscover their bodies as sources of strength rather than trauma. Led group sessions where men and women who had seen the worst of humanity could speak openly about their struggles without fear of judgment. She kept Thomas's handcuffs in a display case in her office, a reminder of where they had all come from, a symbol of the chains that could be broken. On the wall beside the display case hung a framed letter. Thomas's final words, written in the last months of his life when his hands could still manage a pen if he concentrated hard enough. The letter read, "To whoever needs to hear this, you are not alone. The weight you carry was never meant for one person. The pain you hide does not make you weak. The help you need is not something to be ashamed of." I spent most of my life believing that strength meant suffering in silence. I was wrong. My son died because I was wrong. I almost lost my daughter because I was wrong. Real strength is admitting when you are struggling. Real courage is asking for help. Real legacy is teaching others what you wish someone had taught you. If you are reading this, you have already taken the first step. You have walked through the door of a place designed to help. That took courage. That took strength. That makes you a warrior, regardless of what uniform you wear or what battles you have fought. Keep going, one moment at a time, one day at a time, and when you cannot keep going on your own, let others carry you until you can walk again. That is not weakness. That is wisdom. I believe in you. Command Sergeant Major Thomas Beckett, Medal of Honor recipient, father, teacher, survivor. Ryan Beckett stood at the front of a training room at Fort Liberty, facing a class of 20 new soldiers. He was 37 years old now, a staff sergeant, the lead combatives instructor for the base, a position that Elena had held before him and that Thomas had helped create decades ago. The new soldiers watched him with the mixture of curiosity and apprehension that all trainees showed on their first day. They knew his reputation, knew his family history, knew that his grandfather had been a legend, and his aunt had literally written the book on what they were about to learn. Ryan let them wait, let the silence stretch. A technique Elena had taught him, one of many. Then he began, "Today I am going to tell you a story about a woman who moved faster than sight, a story about a man who thought he knew everything and learned he knew nothing. A story about the difference between legends and truth." He walked slowly along the front row of trainees. Several years ago in the armory on this base, a private tried to grab a rifle from a woman he did not recognize. He thought she was weak. He thought she was nothing. He thought his name and his bloodline made him special. He stopped in front of a young soldier who reminded him of himself at that age. Confident, cocky, convinced of his own superiority. That private was me. The soldier's eyes widened slightly. The woman put me on the ground in less than 2 seconds. 1.3, to be exact. The security camera recorded it. For months afterward, people watched that footage and laughed at the arrogant man who got what he deserved. Ryan smiled grimly. They were right to laugh. I was arrogant. I was ignorant. I thought that having the right last name meant I did not have to earn respect. He walked back to the center of the room. But that woman did not just teach me a lesson in humility. She taught me something far more important. She taught me that real strength is not about how fast you can hit. It is about what you do after you have been hit. It is about getting back up. It is about admitting when you are wrong and asking for help to get better. He looked at the faces of the trainees. Her name is Elena Mercer. Some of you have heard of her. The ghost. The woman who wrote the manual you will be studying. The woman who saved lives in a valley in Afghanistan that most of you have never heard of. He paused. She is also my aunt and my teacher, and the person who showed me that the legacy worth inheriting is not made of medals or myths. It is made of choices. The choice to help others, the choice to admit your weaknesses, the choice to keep going even when everything tells you to quit. He moved to a table at the side of the room and picked up a framed photograph. Thomas Beckett in dress uniform, Elena standing beside him, Ryan on his other side. The last photograph taken of the three of them together, 6 months before Thomas died. My grandfather taught me that chains do not define us, that what happens to our bodies does not determine what we become, that the only prison that truly holds us is the one we build in our own minds. He set the photograph down. He is gone now, but his lessons live on in me, in the thousands of soldiers he trained over his career, in the foundation that bears his name and helps veterans find their way through the darkness. Ryan faced the trainees directly. Over the next 12 weeks, I am going to teach you techniques that could save your life. Hand-to-hand combat, weapon retention, ground fighting, all the physical skills you will need to survive if everything goes wrong and you are left with nothing but your body and your training. His voice hardened, but those are not the most important lessons. The most important lessons are these. Ask for help when you need it. Admit when you are struggling. Trust your team more than you trust your ego. And never, ever believe that you are too strong to break. He let the words sink in. Everyone breaks eventually. The difference between those who survive and those who do not is not strength. It is support. It is connection. It is the willingness to let others carry part of the weight. He walked to the door of the training room and opened it. That is the Beckett legacy, not the Medal of Honor in the museum, not the footage of a takedown in an armory, not the myths and legends that people tell about warriors who seem superhuman. He gestured for the trainees to follow him. The real legacy is this. We show up for each other. We carry each other. We refuse to let anyone suffer alone. He led them out into the Carolina morning, where the sun was rising over the pine trees and the training fields waited. Now let us get to work. That evening, after the trainees had been dismissed and the facility had grown quiet, Ryan sat alone in his office. The photograph of Thomas and Elena stood on his desk beside a computer that held training schedules and evaluation reports. On the wall behind him hung a frame containing 3 items. The first was Thomas's final letter, the same one that hung in Elena's office at the Beckett Foundation. She had given Ryan a copy on the day he took over as lead instructor. The second was the Ranger tab Ryan had earned at Fort Benning, mounted on velvet. The third was a folded piece of paper, yellowed with age. Daniel's letter to Elena. The truth about Mogadishu. The confession of a broken man who loved his family but could not find a way to ask for help. Ryan had asked Elena for it after Thomas's funeral, had kept it as a reminder of what happened when burdens were carried alone, of the price that silence extracted, of the future he was determined to prevent for his own soldiers. He looked at the 3 items for a long moment. 3 generations of Beckett's, 3 different battles, 3 different outcomes. Thomas had survived his war and spent decades learning its lessons. Daniel had not survived his, consumed by guilt that no one helped him carry. And Ryan was still writing his story, still becoming whatever he would eventually become, still learning how to honor the legacy without being crushed by it. His phone buzzed, a text from Elena. How was the first day with the new class? Ryan typed back. Good. Told them about the armory, about Grandpa, about what really matters. A pause. Then Elena's response. Proud of you. 3 words, more valuable than any medal. Ryan put down the phone and then looked out the window at the darkening sky. Stars were beginning to emerge, the same stars that had watched over Thomas in his prison cell, over Daniel in his private hell, over Elena in the mountains of Afghanistan, the same stars that would watch over the next generation, and the one after that, until the last soldier hung up their uniform and the last battle was fought. The flame had been passed. Now it was Ryan's turn to carry it forward. He thought about Thomas's words at Arlington, about legacy being what we pass on, about the lessons we teach and the values we instill, and the hope we give to those who come after. He thought about Elena running her foundation, helping veterans find their way back from the darkness. He thought about Sarah Chen, now a captain, leading soldiers of her own, honoring her father's memory through service. He thought about all the young men and women who would pass through his training program over the years to come, all the lessons he would teach, all the lives he might help save. And he understood, finally, what it truly meant to be a Beckett. Not the name, not the blood, not the legends or the myths or the stories people told. Being a Beckett meant showing up, carrying others, refusing to let anyone suffer alone. It meant being human, flawed and afraid and sometimes broken, but never alone. Ryan turned off his desk lamp and headed home. Tomorrow, there would be more trainees to teach, more lessons to share, more opportunities to pass on what Thomas and Elena had given him. The flame would continue to burn. And somewhere beyond the stars, a 74-year-old warrior with steady hands and a peaceful heart was finally at rest, knowing that his legacy was in good hands. Real discipline does not announce itself with volume or flash or swagger. It does not need to. It just is. And when the moment comes, when the test arrives, when everything hangs in the balance, it responds with precision, control, economy of motion, and the kind of unshakable professionalism that leaves no room for doubt. That was the last lesson, and it would echo through generations yet to come. The end.